3 German shepherds lay bound deep in the forest, their eyes fixed on the stranger not with fear, but with the silent knowledge of those who had seen something far beyond terror itself. A young girl dared to step into the woods. A man with an old burn scar chose, at last, to break his silence. But when they uncovered the strange markings beneath the matted fur, the questions began to grow. Who were they? And why were they being hunted? What secret still lingers behind those 3 eyes the world once called useless? Since the cold began crawling down the ridges of Grapine Mountain, every afternoon after school, Nova would disappear down the unnamed dirt paths that twisted through the underbrush and tangled pine roots, paths no one marked and few remembered. She didn't go there for any grand purpose, just an old sketchbook tucked under her arm, a handful of pencils, and a few blank corners of paper left to capture the silhouette of a tree, the blur of a bird mid-flight, or the pressed mark of an animal that had passed before her. These post-school hours became a private rhythm of their own, shared only between Nova and the forest, like some quiet pact made long ago. No noise, no harm, just presence. That afternoon, the chill ran deeper than usual, and a pale mist drifted across noon like a memory not ready to leave. Sunlight fell in scattered patches through the thinning canopy, feeble and wandering, unsure of its place. Nova turned west, toward the steeper slope where roots twisted tighter and the ground bore fewer signs of other feet. She followed a line of freshly disturbed soil, crossed over a mossy rock shaped like the snout of a fox, and lost track of the path while chasing a drawing page that slipped from her hand and danced into the wind. The paper drifted like a leaf, unsure of where it belonged, weaving between upright trunks, circling past the bent spine of a fallen pine, and finally settling in a low, hollowed patch tucked beneath the branches. Nova slid carefully down the slope, gripping dry twigs for balance, and just as her fingers reached the folded sheet, the wind stopped. And in that stillness, she saw them. Huddled together, their bodies thin and frail, fur once proud now knotted with mud, ribs outlined beneath skin stretched too tight, ears drooped with exhaustion. They didn't flinch at her steps, didn't react to her scent or sound. The old frayed cord tied them at the chest, around the stomach, across their necks, binding them into one slack shape, sunken in the cradle of dead leaves. Behind them, the splintered trunk of a broken pine leaned like a collapsed shelter, forming a shadowy alcove damp and still, like a grave no one had finished digging. Nova didn't scream. She froze. Her fingers slowly lowered the crumpled page, eyes blinking as if trying to undo what they had seen. One of the dogs, the largest, coat of deep charcoal streaked with ash, lifted its head, barely, and opened its eyes with painful slowness, like the motion had to be willed up from the deepest place inside. No growl, no whimper, no desperate panting, just a stare, heavy and unblinking, sharp enough to pierce through the roots of what it meant to be human. She stepped back, her heel catching on a twisted root that pulled at her ankle. Pain flashed, but she didn't cry out. Her gaze stayed locked on the 3 figures. That image burned itself into her mind, sharp and unwavering, making everything she had ever drawn before feel suddenly dim and childish. The page slipped from her hand again, and this time she didn't reach for it. She turned and ran, toward the places where the light still fell. There was no path, no markers, but her feet knew. Up the slope, over a dry stream bed, through briars that tore the hem of her shirt, across the forest thick with damp earth and the faint scent of old burning leaves. Nova didn't stop. She didn't look back. Her breath seared through her throat. Palms slick through the air had long turned cold. Her heart pounded with an urgency not for herself, but for something waiting, quietly, painfully, for someone to come. The undergrowth thinned, and the sky widened above her. A weathered cabin appeared, muted and moss-gray against the backdrop of stone and pine. Smoke curled from the chimney in slow, steady pulses, like the breath of an old man who no longer spoke much, but had never stopped listening. Behind the house, Eli Heron stood, one hand resting on an unfinished log, the other gripping a small axe. His back was neither bent nor rigid, just the posture of someone who had lived with weight long enough to know how to carry it. A faded graphite sweater hung loose on his frame, sleeves rolled up over a shirt that revealed the edge of a scar, old and sunken into the skin, burned, rough, and oddly glinting where sunlight touched it. Nova didn't call his name. She walked toward him, trying to keep her breath quiet, but the urgency showed in her eyes. When Eli turned, she was already there, clutching the sleeve of the jacket hanging on the nearby chair. The woods. Dogs. Tied up. Her voice broke through in fragments, choked by wind and tears still caught somewhere inside. Eli didn't frown. He didn't ask questions. His weathered eyes that had once stared through fire, met hers for just a moment. No panic. No coldness. Just an old recognition, as if he'd heard this signal once before, a long time ago. He nodded. Just once. And in that moment, the wind changed direction, sweeping uphill, carrying with it a deeper scent of forest, as though the trees themselves had shifted, clearing the way for something long forgotten to return. He turned and stepped back inside. Nova stood on the porch, gripping the straps of her backpack, hands frozen stiff, but her knees anchored like roots grown fast. She didn't ask anything more. She didn't need comfort. Eli returned with a thick coat, a pair of leather gloves, and a tightly rolled bundle of canvas bound with fraying rope. No words. They just walked. The slope stretched farther now, with the sun already lost behind the ridge, the last rays fading like the wick of a lantern left too long. Beneath their steps, the forest pulled inward, shadows lengthening, branches whispering without sound. Though Nova knew the way, it felt different, as if they had entered a space the world forgot, where the fallen trunks looked like old wounds, and the swinging pine boughs pointed, without speaking, toward something that had waited too long. Eli walked ahead, just as the slope began to steepen. His steps were solid, silent, as if he had once known every patch of soil, every sunken imprint, as though the earth itself had learned to hold him without a sound. The brim of his hat cast his face into shadow, but there was a resolve in every movement he made. Nothing of hesitation, and certainly nothing of fear. He walked like a man who knew that what he was about to witness would etch itself into his being, and yet he chose to walk forward still. When they stopped before the broken pine, Nova didn't need to point. Eli had already seen. The three bodies lay just as before. Not a limb shifted. The wind from earlier hadn't been strong enough to disturb the foliage, and the sky had yet to cry the kind of rain that could blur away what had happened. A silence, unnamed and dense, stretched between them and the three creatures lying in wait. Not a great distance, but heavy, like the dust of time settling across forgotten pages. Eli knelt, one hand extended, slowly, so slowly, not to touch, but simply to let his gaze find again the one it had once known. The black dog, the largest, lying in the center, opened its eyes, as though it had always known this man would return. It didn't move. It didn't whimper. It simply looked. Eli exhaled, a long breath neither weary nor burdened, but one that seemed to release something that had been trapped too long beneath his ribs. He pulled off his glove, and with 2 fingers, gently sifted through the matted fur near the dog's neck, searching for the start of the old rope. The cord had been wound tight in 2 loops, biting deep into the flesh. In the dim light, The raw welts ran clearly from the base of the ear down to the chest. Nova knelt on the opposite side, saying nothing. She watched how Eli worked the knots free, not tearing, not yanking, but applying just enough strength for the loops to loosen, as though he were untying a memory that had been bound too tightly to breathe. When the last piece of rope fell away, the black dog didn't rise. It lay still, eyes half closed, its chest lifting only faintly, but something in its whole form seemed to unfurl, as though, without moving, it had finally found space. Eli removed his coat, laid it gently over a nearby bed of moss, and with great care lifted the dog onto it. Beneath the fur, the body was gaunt, shoulders and hips stark beneath skin, yet the eyes still carried a quiet ember, like a fire not yet extinguished, even under a layer of ash. The other two dogs, one with an ashen coat tinged with cream, the other smaller, with dark golden fur and slightly drooped ears, remained still, but breathing. Eli moved to free them next, his hand steady, marked with calluses deep and old, scars left by fire, water, steel, and time. Once all three lay together on the coat spread across the moss, Eli dropped into a crouch, resting his elbows on his knees. Nova sat beside him, not daring to touch, only watching. She noticed something strange. Though each dog was weak, none turned their head towards the forest. All their eyes were fixed on Eli, even in exhaustion. One dog, the one with the golden fur, stirred just enough to press its muzzle against the edge of the coat. Nova leaned forward, thinking it sought warmth, but then its eyes turned upward. Not to Eli, but to the space just above him, as if waiting for someone to read a signal it could not express itself. Still, Eli said nothing. The wind crawled lower, weaving between the dry pine branches, whispering with a sound that felt like the forest sighing. Nova heard it, and for the first time she sensed something forming, not quite fear, not wholly sorrow, but more like a circle closing after something had been done right. Then Eli rose. He didn't look at Nova. He didn't glance back at the woods. He bent down, wrapping the tarp gently around the three bodies now lying close together, as if he were enclosing something precious, something that could not be allowed to scatter. Every motion he made followed a rhythm slow and deliberate, like an old ritual long abandoned by others, but still preserved in him. Nova stepped forward, lifting her hands to help from one side. She said nothing, but her eyes followed every frayed thread of the cloth, where Eli's fingers moved carefully, drawing together the remnants of a past now cradled in the forest's heart. On the way back, the mist thickened, the ground turned cold and slick beneath their feet. Yet Eli's pace never faltered. Nova walked just behind him, one hand steadying the cloth from slipping off her shoulder, feeling the faint warmth from the coat's inner lining. Neither spoke a word. As they passed an old pine with moss-covered roots, Nova looked up. A strange, deep gouge cut into the bark, too sharp for an animal, too raw for a knife. She almost called out, but Eli had already passed, his eyes fixed on the fog-draped path ahead, not straying once. A single dog hair fell from the coat's edge, settling lightly onto the exposed pine root, dark gold with a trace of red, like a dying ember left behind in the gray forest. Eli's cabin had no fence, no bell. It stood quietly, like a low note in a place where music had long stopped playing. Mist clung to the dark wood roof, and the fireplace still held the soft breath of morning's ashes. When they entered, Nova went immediately to fetch the old wool blanket from the cupboard and the warm water flask from beside the stove, while Eli laid the three dogs gently down on the thick rug near the hearth. No one needed to be told what to do. No one gave orders. No one assumed roles. Every action unfolded as if it had been lived once before, in another life, half remembered and long erased. The black dog was laid down first. Eli opened the coat's collar, placed a soft cloth beneath its head. Nova saw its ears twitch slightly when Eli fed new logs into the stove, and the fire crackled to life. She didn't know how much it could hear, but something in the warmth of the air seemed to reach it. An invisible calm beyond explanation. The other two were laid beside it, the gray one tilted toward the firelight, while the golden one curled its face between its paws. Eli took off his gloves, placed his hand lightly upon each dog's chest, like one checking for life, not with tools, but with memory. The room warmed quickly, not only from the fire, but from the soft rhythm of breathing that now filled the space, from the release of bodies no longer held by ropes. Nova sat by the window, eyes looking through the misted glass, ears attuned to every quiet sound within. When she turned back, she met the gaze of the golden dog. It looked at her, and she could not tell if it recognized her, or if it simply sought something gentler in what was left. The next morning came cloaked in a soft, ash-gray sky. The clouds weren't heavy, yet they held back the sun, as if uncertain whether to break or hold. The scent of toasted bread and thin coffee drifted gently through the small wooden kitchen. Eli, never one for a large breakfast, still poured a cup of warm milk for Nova. And when she reached out to take it, his eyes drifted momentarily toward the fireplace before he asked, his voice low, worn, and rarely that clear. "What do you think? Their names might be?" Nova paused, caught off guard. She had no ready answer. She had never named anything before, aside from a few tiny cacti on her balcony. But in her mind, the eyes, the movements, the quiet endurance of all three dogs had already etched themselves into her as something singular, something separate and alive. Eli didn't push her. He set the cup down on the table, wiped his hands on the linen hanging by the counter, and walked slowly over. He knelt beside the black, furred dog, looked into its eyes once more. Not long, just long enough to see that same gaze still there, not the gaze of a creature pleading to be saved, but the steady, watchful eyes of something standing guard over something more sacred than itself. "Kiro," he said softly. Nova turned toward him. She didn't ask why. She just knew that if Eli, a man who never wasted a word, gave that name, it was one meant to last. The black dog, now Kiro, didn't stir, didn't flinch, but its breathing shifted slightly, like a breeze slipping gently through a long closed crack, quiet and perfectly placed. When Nova sat down beside the gray-coated one, she noticed the way its ears twitched, always, whether it was wind brushing past the walls, the creak of timber, or the subtle clink of a spoon against glass. It wasn't just hearing, it was reception, like the dog was some finely tuned instrument that had never been properly strung, but still held every note. "Maple," she whispered, so quietly the name felt as if it had been plucked from the silence, rather than spoken into it. Eli didn't turn, but he heard, and he said nothing, like the name had already been resting in the room, waiting for someone to say it aloud on a morning like this one. That left the smallest dog, the one with dark, golden fur and folded ears. It never looked anyone directly in the eye, yet each time Nova rose to move, it would stretch ever so slightly toward her, head lowered, not in submission but in silent calibration, always choosing a spot just far enough not to intrude, yet close enough not to disappear. She gently stroked the ridge of its back, rising and falling with the soft, uneven rhythm of breath, then placed her hand between its shoulders, where the warmth gathered. "Rune," she said, the way someone might set a small stone into a waiting palm. This time, Eli turned. But again, he didn't ask why. He only looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to the stove and filled another cup with coffee. From that morning on, The names settled into the air as if they had always belonged there. Kiro began to open his eyes more often, his head lifting slowly each time Eli passed nearby. Maple's ears would tilt sharply, her head angling with intent whenever a nail dropped or the door clicked open. And Rune, quietest of the three, never strayed far from Nova's side, without a word, without a leash, always just there. By the third day, Nova was tidying the blanket by the fireplace when she noticed a long scratch running along one edge of the fabric. She assumed it was from a claw, but when her fingers traced the tear, they touched a faint seam of thread, delicate and thin, clearly not part of the original stitching. She meant to ask Eli, but he was outside in the backyard, splitting firewood, the slanted light hitting his arm just enough to make the old burn scar gleam, stretching all the way to the elbow. Rune lay curled near the doorway, eyes half closed. But when Nova stepped near, Rune opened them, and for the first time, a sound emerged. It wasn't a bark. It was a rasp, faint and caught in the throat, like a warning that had been swallowed halfway. Nova stopped. The sunlight angled in from the yard and fell across a carved mark on the wooden door frame. A symbol burned faintly into the grain. Not quite a letter, not quite an image, just a gouge deep and sudden, as though someone had once tried to carve something but abandoned it halfway through. Rune didn't look away. She crouched down slowly, hand reaching but not yet touching, when another hand landed on her shoulder from behind. Gentle, but firm enough to still her breath. Eli stood there, his shadow stretching long across the floor, casting partly over the carved mark. In his hand was the same cloth he had used to wipe his hands earlier, still holding the faint smell of menthol oil. His eyes weren't on Rune. They were fixed on Nova, as though he already knew the question forming in her mind. "Not now," he said quietly, then turned back toward the hearth. Nova said nothing. Rune made no further sound. The quiet wrapped itself back around the cabin like it had that very morning, with only the faint warmth of cedar lingering in the walls and the rhythmic clink of iron from the old stovetop filling the silence. That afternoon, rain fell in soft, scattered waves. The first drops of the season tapped gently on the tin roof. Not hurried, just steady, like fingers keeping time on a wooden desk. Eli sat in the wooden chair near the window, a steel comb in his hand, brushing slowly through the tangled coat on Kiro's back. Nova sat not far away, Maple's head resting on her lap, while Rune remained curled near the door, eyes shut again, but ears tuned as if nothing had changed. The light inside the cabin had softened with the rain, casting a warm hue across Kiro's back, where the fur shimmered like polished bronze. Eli combed with care, not with strength, but with rhythm, until his hand froze, fingers pausing at a spot just behind the dog's left ear, where the skin drew tight and something beneath it resisted the brush. Nova looked up. "What is it?" Eli didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, pressing 2 fingers gently into the fur at that spot. Beneath the surface there was a patch of skin thinner than usual, its edge firm like the rim of molded plastic, and at the center sat a small circular scar. Perfectly even, no larger than half the tip of a pinky. He pulled a cloth from his pocket, wiped his hand, and without a word stood up and walked down the hallway toward the old storage room at the very end. Nova watched him go. Moments later, Eli returned, carrying a wooden box, inside which sat a small flashlight and a round lens. He clicked the light on, tilted it carefully toward the scar. Under the narrow beam, something shimmered faintly, a thin silver edge glinting like a thread of light pulled taut beneath the skin. "This isn't a regular scar," he said quietly. "It's a kind of embedded seam." Nova furrowed her brow. It wasn't a term she had ever encountered. Not in veterinary studies, nor in any handbook on animal behavior or care. Eli offered no further explanation. Instead, he moved toward the wooden table in the corner where an old landline phone sat. He picked up the receiver and punched in a sequence of numbers so well worn the digits had faded beneath his fingers. The phone rang only once. "Yates here." The voice was measured and calm, not fast, not slow, but every word struck with the clarity of metal meeting blade. "It's Eli." A pause. "How long has it been?" "Almost 8 years." "Why now?" "There are 3 of them. One has a mark that matches a tracking unit, placed near the cervical spine. Seam design, no sign of infection." Nova listened, closely, as though each word were part of a language that only made sense when spoken in the right order, under the right breath. "Can you bring them in?" "No." "Can you send a photo?" "No." "Then what do you want?" "Do you remember the last time we spoke? You said, 'One day something will come back, but not the way we expect.'" A silence, longer this time, crept through the line. "I remember. I think it's beginning." Eli returned the receiver to its cradle. He didn't explain. He simply pulled out a folded piece of aged paper, scribbled a few words on it, then tucked it atop the high cupboard, far beyond where the eye would casually fall. By then, Rune had already moved away from the doorway and was lying beneath the table, his eyes fully open, locked on Eli, unblinking. That afternoon, when clouds gathered and the rain dulled the forest light into the gray softness of wet paper, Eli set to work again, refreshing the bedding, changing the water, and examining each collar that had once been removed. Nova noticed something peculiar on Maple's collar, a small emblem pressed into the leather, a double helix triangle, stylized like strands of DNA twisted and closed. She had never seen that symbol in any book, nor among the common markings of standard breeding facilities. When she reached to touch it, Maple sneezed softly, then nudged his head into her hand, baring more of his neck, and beneath the fur was a faint circle. Another mark. Eli noticed. He grabbed the light, angled it close. Rune stepped forward then. No one called him. No signal was given. He simply approached Nova, then turned and sat beside Eli, tilting his head. Not in confusion, but as if waiting for something he had always known would come. Eli parted Rune's fur. There it was. Another scar. Same shape, same position, same seamless edge. Slowly, Eli stood. He moved toward the old bookshelf near the fireplace, drew out a thin notebook from between the rows. No title on the cover, just a worn paper spine wrapped in fabric tape. He flipped to the first page. A symbol, hand-drawn, repeated in spirals, identical to the one on Maple's collar. Nova opened her mouth to ask, but Eli was already on the porch, standing in the mist, his eyes focused on the distant pine, the one near which they had first found the 3 bodies. The wind was shifting, the trees tilted gently, and somewhere in the rain there was a sound, not near but not quite far either, the crunch of tires coming to a stop on gravel, a sound out of place in a forest where few ever passed. The vehicle appeared minutes later, mud streaking the tires, rainwater flying off in long arcs along the path. A man stepped out, lean frame, heavy raincoat drawn tight. But when the porch light struck his glasses, Nova recognized him instantly. Dr. Yates. He didn't smile. He didn't speak a greeting. He simply unzipped the coat, tapped a hand to the pouch at his side, and entered like someone returning to a place that had once been his. Eli tilted his head toward the interior room, where Kiro, Maple, and Rune lay upon fresh cloths, resting but alert. Dr. Yates set his canvas bag on the table, unzipped it, and removed a small scanning device, sleek and compact, no larger than his palm. His eyes never left the 3 animals watching him. No fear in them, no shrinking back, only a stillness that suggested familiarity. Not with him, but with what he represented. "I'll start with this one," he said, nodding toward Kiro. The scanner emitted a low red light, sweeping slowly from the base of the skull to the shoulder. A sound, a small decisive click, broke the silence. Dr. Yates looked at Eli. "Batch 7M. Eli didn't flinch, but the hand resting on the table curled slightly, fingertips whitening. "You're sure?" "Positive. Programming tag still intact. Remote startup protocol wiped, but the signal grid remains. Each has a unique code, but the format is consistent. Tracking structure assigned only to K9A level units." Nova turned, her voice hushed. "What level?" Dr. Yates glanced briefly at Eli, then answered quietly. "Aegis." A single word, one syllable. But the moment it left his mouth, the air in the room thickened, like dust shaken loose from long sealed walls. "That program—" Nova hesitated. "Wasn't it terminated?" Dr. Yates didn't answer. Instead, he moved to Maple, past the scanner once more. Another click. The screen lit up with a line of characters that pulsed slowly. The red light spilled across his face, outlining deep creases near his eyes. Creases born not from age, but from sleeplessness, tied to too many unanswered questions. "They didn't terminate it," he said at last. "They only said they did." Eli's voice came then, low, steady, stripped of feeling. "And the ones that didn't meet the criteria?" "Reassigned to experimental. Later, marked for disposal." "What list?" "Internal." Yates powered off the scanner. The reflection of the room's golden light lingered in his glasses. Twin shards of metal waiting for fire. "No one's supposed to know this, and if these three are what remains of Batch 7M, then either someone broke protocol or—" He paused, voice trailing. "Something is finding its own way back, on a path no one anticipated, and no one can now stop." Nova sat beside Maple. She wasn't sure what she felt, only that something was slowly turning, quietly, behind the rain-slick spine of time, like a wheel that had once been forced to halt, now seeking again its original rhythm. Kiro lifted his head, his ears pointed, not toward anyone in the room, but toward the half-closed door, where wind slipped between the wooden boards like an unfinished sentence left hanging in the air. Yates opened a second bag and removed a weathered map, creased, yellowed, drawn on thick parchment and sealed in a waterproof case. He spread it across the table, finger landing near the banks of the Dustmore River, where, long ago, a facility once operated that never made it to the public record. "All of Batch 7M originated here. As far as I know, the facility was shut down 4 years ago. But—" He paused again. Eli stepped closer, eyes tracing the faded lines, stopping at a triangle of 3 stacked layers, a symbol repeating again. "What else?" "They used isolated frequency bands to call each group back when needed. But with 7 million, after the last test, they wiped the recall grid completely." "But the hardware? It's still inside them?" Eli asked, voice steady but low. "Yes," Yates replied. "Biological chip format. It doesn't emit any signal unless it's activated by a coded command. Think of it like a lock without a key, harmless unless turned the right way." Nova reached out, brushing her hand gently along Rune's back. The fur was warm beneath her fingertips, its breathing calm and steady. Yet each time her touch drifted near the nape of the neck, she could feel a slight stiffening beneath the skin, not enough to flinch, not enough to flee, but just enough to wonder whether what rose there was a reflex or a memory. "If no one is calling them," she asked, her voice soft, "why do they move at all?" Yates didn't answer. Eli turned his gaze towards the window. The rain still fell outside, but the wind had shifted. A single pine branch tapped against the glass, leaving behind a long smear of water, like a handwritten line dragged sideways across a page too damp to hold its shape. Dr. Yates stood. I need to make contact with someone. If there's any data that hasn't been erased, there's only one place that might still hold a copy. Where? Eli asked. Yates unlocked his phone, typed in a few words, and then turned his head. The Independent Archive Unit. Ridgegate. It hasn't been operational in the public sense for years. I have to leave immediately, before they trace any signal that might have left this place. He turned to Nova, hesitating just a breath. And you, don't let your hand rest too long near their necks, not until the trust is complete. Some reflex commands are still embedded deep, and if they've ever been triggered before— Eli raised a hand, cutting him off. She'll know when it's time to pull back. Yates didn't argue. He packed his bag in silence, stepped onto the porch, pulled his coat collar up to his chin, and disappeared down the pine-covered slope, his figure folding into the gray, slick morning without looking back. The cabin exhaled silence once more. Nova sat beside Cairo, her back resting gently against the leg of the old bench, eyes following the thin rivulet of water tracing its way down the window pane. Her palm still lay across Rune's neck, not pressing, not testing, just resting close enough to sense a signal, something unspoken but moving, as real as breath. Across the room, Eli hadn't moved. He stood as he had when Yates walked out, his eyes fixed on the door that had quietly clicked shut. His left hand grazed the surface of the wooden table, where the lamp's light fell in a warm streak of honey gold across the grain. What he had just heard wasn't new. It was simply the dust being blown off old ash, revealing an ember that never quite went out. Aegis Program. A name once murmured during the final night shifts of a long-forgotten fire station nearly a decade ago. There had never been press releases, no circulated records, just scattered accounts from officers called in to assist with so-called specialized drills no one ever wanted to speak of again. Eli remembered standing at the edge of one of those test zones, sometime in the fall of that year. His unit had been deployed to control a fire inside a fabricated forest. Nothing but canvas tents and stacked fuel drums, built to burn. They were told not to cross the red paint line. Their job was only to observe, to wait for the signal. When the fire was lit and the smoke billowed high in churning spirals, they saw it. 3 dark figures breaking through the blaze, silent and deliberate, not flinching when sparks clung to their backs. They didn't respond to the trainer's voice, which boomed distorted through loudspeakers. They didn't stop, didn't turn. They just ran, straight through, toward a point that had clearly been marked or programmed by something no human could see. That day, Eli remembered someone from his crew whispering, not out of fear, but wonder, like watching the boundaries of biology stretch past recognition. But later, the internal report only included one line: nothing of note observed. He had convinced himself back then that it was just another test, one of the many meaningless, overfunded exercises dressed up under the name of strategic firefighting. But now, with 3 creatures lying just meters away, each bearing the same scars, the same reactions, the same eyes that had once stared through smoke without blinking, Eli knew these weren't pets. Cairo, whose gaze held the weight of a life already lived, lay with his head tilted slightly, ears lifted, eyes not on Nova, but on him. It wasn't a gaze seeking approval. It was something else. Confirmation. Maple was different, hyper-aware, reacting to every clink of a cup, the swish of a coat sleeve, even the quiet rustle of paper from Eli's back pocket. Her body flinched and reset in perfect calibration, as though her mind had learned to categorize sounds. What was danger and what was not. And Rune, the one who had barely moved or spoken, was now the first to come forward when Eli crouched down. Not cautiously, not with affection. Rune didn't lick, didn't nuzzle, just sat beside the hem of his coat, like someone who had marched the same road too many times, and now needed no further introduction. These aren't house dogs. Nova looked up. Eli didn't continue immediately. His fingers moved slowly along Rune's neck, finding the intersection of fur and scar, tracing it as one might follow a weathered landmark now hidden beneath moss. And they're not domesticated animals. His voice carried no judgment, no anger, just recognition, like someone who had once walked through a burning forest and could still name the exact place where the first spark had caught. Nova looked at the three of them again. Something in the room had shifted. Not colder, not warmer, just a different breath pattern. A subtle recalibration, as though even the air knew they could no longer be called what they were before. Eli rose and walked to the table. He opened a small wooden box. Inside was a steel badge, his old station ID from when he served. He stared at it for a moment, then set it aside and pulled a thin sheet of paper tucked at the bottom, the one he had kept hidden, a draft of something never formally recognized. It was a faded photocopy of an internal document. At the top, the header read, Aegis Deployment Tier 3, Emergency Recall Protocol. Below it, 3 numeric codes, each linked to a specific frequency, tones, not encryption, but audio signals meant to call back or disable defense programming. Eli laid the page on the table, his eyes still, his fingers brushing the paper's edge like he was remembering its weight rather than reading its words. They designed a recall signal. In case of malfunction, all it took was a frequency broadcast through internal channels. The entire unit would turn around, no matter where they were. Nova swallowed, her voice barely audible. And if they're never called back? Eli looked at her. The light from the oil lamp cast a narrow shadow down his nose, sharp as a chisel line. Then they won't stop. Rune now stood near the door. Maple and Cairo had shifted as well, not far from each other, but each watching from a separate angle. They didn't bark. They didn't growl. They simply waited, as if something was about to begin, and somehow they already understood their roles. Nova rose, slowly, her steps carrying her toward the threshold, her eyes drawn to the pale light beyond the porch. The rain had eased, but the earth still held its wet sheen. A final drop of water fell from the eaves, landing on a faint paw print left by Rune. And instead of disappearing into the ground, it split in two, as if it had struck some hidden groove beneath the soil. Eli looked down at the damp floor, at the faint mud tracks still clinging to the tile since morning. 3 prints, 3 directions, but the same point of origin. The window shivered softly. From beyond the forest line, a beam of light swept across the treetops. There was no sound, no siren, no engine hum, just a single strip of brightness gliding through the canopy like a silent inspection. Unspoken, unnamed, yet precise enough to draw the attention of beings once conditioned to respond without question. Eli turned to Nova. He didn't gesture. He didn't speak. He simply stepped back once, his hand resting gently on the door that hadn't yet closed. Rune shifted forward, and Cairo, for the first time, let out a low, restrained growl, deep enough to feel more like memory than threat, like the last sentence of a command line that no one ever had the courage to delete. The air inside the cabin thickened, condensed into a layer of haze clinging to the window panes already fogged since dusk. The beam of the vehicle returned, this time pausing longer at the edge of the wooden porch, shimmering faintly against the weathered boards where the paint had long faded into the grain. Nova turned her head toward Eli, silently asking whether to turn off the lights. but he had already lifted his hand from the door and was walking toward the porch steps. His stride was unhurried, unafraid, as if preparing to greet an acquaintance who had chosen an unusual hour to visit. The vehicle engine ceased. Then came the sound of a car door closing. Low, deliberate, not heavy, but broadcast just enough that the forest might notice. The man who stepped into view wore a black blazer that caught the fractured light between the trees. Polished leather shoes, a clean-shaven jaw, a buttoned-up collar with no room for air or dissent. Every detail was chosen to radiate control, with no space left for doubt. He carried no umbrella, didn't lower his gaze as he crossed the damp soil, and when he stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes rested on Eli for no more than 3 seconds before speaking. "I represent the National Asset Recovery Division. We've traced several asset codes to this location, linked to an old Homeland Security lot." Eli didn't respond at once. His eyes weren't on the man but on the ground beneath him, a track of dried mud shaped like a narrow tire tread, unlike any vehicle that belonged near Gray Pine. "What asset?" Eli asked, voice even. The man drew a thin metal badge from his coat's inner pocket. No insignia, no department seal. Just a symbol etched in gray, a triangle encircling 3 interlocked rings, with a row of foreign characters beneath that Nova couldn't decipher from where she stood. 3 units, batch 7M designation, K-type biological forms, risk level retrieval restricted, last verified location recorded here. I'm under orders to collect." "You have a court order?" Eli asked again, slower this time. The man shook his head, unfazed. "Not required in emergency recall protocol. These aren't domestic animals, and they're not considered civilian property. You're aware of that." Rune now stood just inside the doorway, not stepping forward, but not retreating either. Its gaze locked onto the man like a laser drawn from the past. Unwavering, unafraid. Nova's hand rested behind Rune, not pulling, not holding, just placed gently to let it know that another heartbeat stood beside its own. Eli stepped forward, just enough to position himself between the stranger and the threshold. "There's no documentation here, and they're under medical treatment. I'm the only registered caregiver on site." The man's mouth twitched, less a smile than the reflex of someone who had heard that phrase many times before and had memorized exactly how to bypass it. "Mr. Eli Herron, former Chief of Fire Squad 12, retired 2017. I respect your service, but systems aren't run on sentiment. We operate by command protocols." Eli didn't step back, but his eyes flicked to a small detail, the 3rd button on the man's coat, where a faint scratch could be seen, barely visible unless one had worn uniforms long enough to know, the mark of reissued government stock. "You need to be off this property within 10 minutes. The rain's returning, and this porch isn't wide enough to hold repeated statements." The man's brow creased. It wasn't clear whether from the words or the realization that, in the dim light behind Eli, all 3 forms were now standing. Not barking, not backing away, just watching, like creatures who had long known the shape of people like him. He didn't advance, but neither did he leave. He pulled out his phone, typed something, then tucked it away again. A record, perhaps, to be cited later as part of an incident file. Eli turned back inside without another word. The door shut, not slammed, not drawn softly, but closed with the weight of finality, defining a boundary between 2 worlds, one warmed by the fading heat of a wood stove, by scars still healing, by eyes that once had numbers instead of names, and the other, held in the cold breath of the forest, beneath a moon stretched thin like a smudge on torn paper, behind a man still framed by the headlights that never dimmed. Nova looked at Eli, not with a question this time, but with the quiet recognition of someone hearing an old song for the first time in years. No need to understand the lyrics, just knowing it had always been playing. "Will he come back?" she asked softly. Eli didn't answer right away. His hand touched the strap of an old leather glove resting on the table, squeezing it briefly as if testing whether its lining had held up through the years. Then he turned toward the window, where the vehicle lights began to pull away, slow, hesitant, but not yet defeated. The fire had long since gone out. Only the gentle warmth of ashen bricks remained. The oil lamp's golden light couldn't reach the far corners of the room, where shadows stretched like extensions of the beings within, as though they had always been part of the house itself. Rune lay by the door, not asleep. Her ears flicked with each draft that slipped through the timber walls. Kiro had positioned himself in the center hallway, body aligned to see every entry. Maple, most unlike herself, rested by Nova's feet, eyes never straying from the wooden door that remained ever so slightly ajar, as if she already knew the night would not pass in silence. Eli returned after a few minutes outside. He touched the gun rack but didn't remove anything. Just a check. The kind of habit born from years spent inside seasons of crisis, the understanding that not all weapons are made of steel and powder. "Get some rest," he said, though it sounded nothing like a command. Nova didn't move. She sat on the floor, her back against the old bench, eyes fixed on the ring of lighter fur around Maple's neck, like the fading imprint of a collar long gone. No one in the cabin slept. And the night did not wait long. The first sound came like a whisper, a single branch cracking beneath a weight no bird could account for. Kiro sprang to his feet, neck extended toward the rear of the house. Maple gave a low growl, the sound not from her throat but deep in her chest. Rune, without waiting for signal or command, moved to Eli's side, her eyes sweeping the shadowed wall line as if reading from a memory only she had memorized. Eli stepped toward the bookshelf, pulled out a flashlight, and twisted the dial just to the first setting. The beam didn't light the whole room, but it was enough to catch the movement of suspended dust beginning to shift. Footsteps on the wet grass, not fast, not rushed, but carrying the rhythm of someone trained to leave no mark. And then the wind died, abruptly, unnaturally, like the forest itself was waiting to see who would speak first. Kiro lunged toward the rear door and barked, once, loud and sharp, not from fear, but to declare, "We are not unaware." A sharp sound broke the silence, metal striking glass, coming from somewhere near the fence that lined the trail. Eli turned, calm but precise, opened the drawer, and retrieved a small cylindrical whistle, old and worn, wired to an analog transmitter once used for emergency calls in his former unit. He didn't blow into it. He simply held it tightly, the weight of it settling into his palm like something long dormant now stirring awake, and his eyes paused, locked on Nova. "Not surveillance," he said, low, clear, final. Nova nodded faintly, but she could feel a coldness tracing along her back, and it had nothing to do with the wind slipping in through the window cracks. It was the shift in the dog's posture that caused it, that subtle, chilling change. Rune lowering himself until his body flattened to the floor, Maple rotating both ears backward in sharp, trained alignment, while Kiro moved in a quiet, calculated arc around the window, careful not to enter the light, careful not to cast a shadow. The first silhouette passed the glass, not distinct, not yet human, just a long shadow bisecting the narrow beam from the oil lamp in a way that felt less like movement and more like a wet streak bleeding across an unfinished page. Eli reached for the mechanical latch of the side door, and while the movement was slow, it carried a gravity that could not be mistaken. He turned his head, motioning Nova back, toward the kitchen, toward the narrow door that led into the rear storeroom, and from there, if needed, into the forest. Nova didn't move. Instead, she knelt beside Maple, gently pulling the edge of the coat over his body again, whispering something too soft for anyone but him to hear. Yet his ear twitched slightly, a silent confirmation that he had. Outside, the light shifted. No longer the warm pulse of headlights. It was a flashlight now, harsh, white, surgical, a kind of beam meant not to reveal, but to blind. Rune extended forward, nose lifted, eyes locked on the edge of the curtain. Then a bark, louder this time, followed by two more. But they didn't join. They struck in separate rhythm, three distinct signals echoing like ancient bells across the hollow of the woods, marking not time, but trespass, declaring that the night was no longer whole, and that a boundary, once secure, had been crossed. The footsteps withdrew, but not back toward the path. They curled eastward, toward the steeper part of the woods, the darker edge where the ground grew unstable and the shadows multiplied, where escape was harder, but hiding was easier. A figure broke from the trees, darting past the fence like a black arrow. Eli couldn't make out the face, but Nova saw something. A red streak at the left wrist, a tattoo or maybe a mark, not clear, but unmistakably placed at the exact location where biological trackers were once implanted. "They're being hunted," Eli said, voice barely above breath, his gaze still fixed on the door's narrow frame. Kiro barked sharply, the sound ricocheting toward the ceiling, hitting the corner where a loose board trembled in the sudden gust, an imperceptible draft disturbed by movement too deliberate to be chance. Nova tightened her grip on the bag's strap. Maple pressed closer to her side, head tilted, not in fear, but as if listening to the rhythm of her breathing, adjusting his own heartbeat to match hers, syncing with the cadence of something he didn't fully understand but could feel. Outside, the sounds diminished, step by step, until there was only stillness again. But Rune didn't move. He remained on the floor, neck low, eyes wide and trained on a point deep in the trees, a point no one else in the room could see. A point that was coming, silently. Eli placed a hand on Nova's shoulder, so gently it didn't startle her. He leaned in close, voice pitched just above silence. "In the morning, we'll need to scan Maple's chip data." Nova turned to him, nodded slowly. She understood now. This was no longer about the dogs. This was about a missing link, one removed, perhaps deliberately, from a chain of decisions now fraying at every edge. The gray light of morning crept in through the curtainless window. The forest was still, but the brightness had sharpened everything, exposing the scratch across the floor from where Rune had slipped in his sudden sprint the night before, and the scattered strands of fur that lay like quiet evidence around the base of the table, signaling in a language no one spoke that something had happened here, something not yet finished. Eli placed the chip scanner gently on the wooden table. Nova stood behind him, notebook in hand, tracking every serial number they had gathered over the past days. Rows of code that once seemed sterile, impersonal, but now weighed heavier with each scan, like numbers that remembered more than they revealed. The scanner beeped, finally, after nearly 30 seconds of passing over Maple's neck. A line of code appeared. Eli looked at the small screen, and his eyes darkened as the letters emerged one by one. Aegis 7 MRN CVEX-004.1291. Nova froze. "CVEX, is that an abbreviation?" she asked, her voice tight, her eyes still locked on the glowing text. Eli didn't respond immediately. He turned, walked to the old cabinet, and pulled from it a thin file, something that had sat untouched for over 5 years. He flipped through the pages quickly, and then stopped, at a blurred black and white photo, grainy, taken through a reflective surface, showing a man standing in the middle of a training field, a directional rod in his hand, his face half obscured by the harsh sun behind him. "Connor Vexley," Eli said quietly, "senior breeder for Aegis, once praised as the one who engineered beings that didn't feel pain." Nova turned to the caption. The red italicized print beside the name read, "Suspended indefinitely. Reason, exceeding control thresholds, caused irreversible neural damage." She read the line again. Then again. And finally, softly, "He's the one who designed them." Eli nodded. Not just designed. He controlled batch 7 million directly. And if these 3 came from that batch... He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Nova understood. Rune, Kiro, and Maple weren't just survivors. They were evidence. Eli opened a yellowed envelope and slid out a printed page from an old classified report. A hand-drawn layout of a training compound, a list of host specimens, lines of biological data, and finally a stamped signature still bold despite the age of the ink, CVX.12, Vexley. Nova ran her fingers through the thick fur at Rune's neck, pausing where the light had once caught a small raised node, metal, embedded, barely detectable beneath the skin. "If he was suspended," she began, but Eli cut in. Quiet, firm. "Doesn't mean he stopped?" The window light stretched a pale stripe across the map of gray pine forest spread on the table. Nova noticed a small red circle drawn near the eastern edge, close to the site of an old ranger outpost, long abandoned, where Yates once said biosamples were transferred for units never listed on official records. Eli picked up a pen and drew a line, from that red dot, straight to the cabin where they now stood. "If I were Vexley," he said, his voice colder now, sharper, "and I knew Batch 7M wasn't fully destroyed, and if I'd just confirmed the 3 missing units had resurfaced here." Nova remained still. She didn't dare ask how that sentence would end. Eli's eyes had changed. Gone was the quiet gaze of retirement. What remained was the steel, a glint she hadn't seen before, except perhaps in stories whispered of men who had once walked through fire. "He'll come back," Eli said. "Not alone. Not in a vehicle with real plates." Nova kept her gaze on the map, her hand resting on the scar at Rune's nape, where a patch of fur still held the dark stain of dried blood, not from a wound made by tooth or blade, but from the rejection of an implant forced into a mind too young to consent. "If anyone still keeps files on Batch 7M," Nova murmured, "they won't be in the open network." Eli's eyes shifted toward the old kitchen phone. He unplugged the cord, reattached it to the analog signal transmitter, and input a frequency. Long and low, a sequence of compressed pulses not routed through satellites, not bounced off towers, but sent instead through buried lines and forgotten channels. A signal meant for one person, someone Eli had once trusted, someone who, like him, had outlived the fire, but had never stopped watching the smoke. "I need a code name," Nova said. Eli looked up, nodding slowly. "Vexley, designation Spectre 9. Nova scribbled it down into her notebook, right beside the chip code belonging to Maple. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of understanding that in that quiet second, she was holding a missing piece of a spine that once belonged to something far larger than she'd ever been allowed to see. Rune nudged her palm, not licking, not whining, just contact, like a wordless message carried not by sound, but by presence. And just beyond the window, the light of early afternoon shifted, broken for a moment by a streak of shadow sliding along the edge of the house. Not a branch, not a person, just a silhouette with the posture of something that had once been trained to move without sound. But this time, it left a smudge of damp soil on the wooden porch, like a footprint returning to a place it had once left behind. Nova didn't wait for nightfall. She left a handwritten note for Eli, pressed to the kitchen doorframe, then slipped into the old fireman's coat he had left on the back of the chair. Not for warmth, but because the coarse, heavy fabric felt like putting on a memory, like being protected by the past of someone who once stood at the line between what was human and what should never have been allowed to fall into the dark. The electric bike carried her down the dirt slope, curving around the northern hill, stopping before a tin-roofed shack beside an abandoned warehouse. A crooked LED light above the side wall flickered 3 times, then shut off. A silent cue known only to one boy. Jaden, 14, living with his grandmother, once caught on a police station security feed just because he wanted to see how they stored pictures of missing dogs. A kid with a slanted smile and eyes that never looked at anyone longer than 2 seconds, but fingers that moved across a keyboard with the urgency of someone carrying the key to vaults adults, had long decided children didn't need to know. His room smelled of warm wires and plastic housing stretched thin from overuse. The glow from 3 monitors lit the space like a lab in hiding, one showing satellite data, another pulsing with geothermal maps, the third running command lines connected to an old server somewhere in the eastern districts. Nova didn't ask how he had access. She just pulled a small chip from her coat pocket, the one she had removed from beneath Rune's fur, and set it gently on the cloth with puppy patterns next to the keyboard. Jaden didn't ask why. He just glanced at the chip, inserted it into a custom reader, and began typing. The code unfolded like a storm bursting over water. Strange characters, embedded algorithms, files time-stamped during days Nova remembered as peaceful, though the creatures listed in those entries had already been locked inside laboratories. "This was a marked batch," Jaden said, his voice as flat as if reading a comic. "Official designation, Batch 7M behavioral units flagged as unfit for deployment." Nova leaned in, reading as red text appeared at the top of the data panel. "Behavioral rejections, scheduled for destruction within 48 hours of classification." "No record of transfer?" she asked. Jaden shook his head. "None. No transport log. No intake from any rescue facility, but there's one line worth noting." He enlarged a segment of code at the end. "Transfer attempt blocked. Clearance level insufficient." Nova blinked. Someone had tried to save them, tried to send them out, but didn't have the authority. Jaden entered a new string, pulled up an archived image, surveillance footage from inside the training facility. A gray-toned frame emerged. 3 vague shapes pressed close together inside a steel kennel labeled Aegis HLD7. In another frame, a person stood outside the cage, one hand resting on the bars, their shadow stretched long behind them like a claw suspended in hesitation. "This is the only person who accessed 7 million after classification," Jaden explained. "But the file's been cut. No clear photo, just a login tag. VX-0129. Nova exhaled slowly, as if trying to push out something that had begun to form in the back of her chest. She thought of Rune's gaze, the scar carved like a broken implant along Maple's neck, and of Cairo, who always stood between the other two, like a sentinel who needed no words to be understood. "Is there anything else?" she asked. Jaden nodded. "There's an audio log." He put on a pair of headphones, passing her one earpiece. Static came first, then the low murmur of a man's voice, barely more than a whisper. "There's nothing wrong with them. The error's in the way someone defined behavior. If they survive, they prove that emotion doesn't ruin a soldier. It creates something greater than a soldier." Silence followed. A breath. Then the file ended. Jaden took off the headset. He didn't say anything. Nova nodded, lifted the chip, and tucked it back into her coat. She stepped out into the pale blue light of the screens, leaving behind a space where answers didn't come with declarations or shouting, but in a frequency lower than grief. Truth. Night fell faster than she expected on the ride back. Rain began to fall in soft, steady lines, creating a rhythm behind the quiet hum of tires sliding across wet earth. Nova didn't look directly at the trees, but now and then, in the edge of her vision, something moved. Not in a way that frightened her, but like a presence listening, following, staying close. By the time she returned to the cabin, the lights were off. But a faint glow flickered from the rear porch, the place where Eli often sat during sleepless nights, nursing lukewarm tea. Nova climbed the steps and pushed the door gently open. She didn't call his name. She saw the envelope first, placed in the center of the table. Brown paper, hand-lettered. "If I don't return within 3 hours, go where Vexley began, under the name Echo Station." And next to the note, 3 collars, Rune, Kiro, and Maples, unbuckled and arranged in a perfect line. The porch light still glowed, but there was no breath left in the cabin. Only the soft knock of wind through the cracks in the wooden frame, whispering into the silence as if the house itself were trying to hear what would happen next. Nova tightened her backpack straps. Her eyes drifted over the scuff marks on the tabletop. Then she turned and stepped outside, calling for the 3 beings she had once saved, once touched. Rune emerged first from behind the garden, fur damp, collarless, gaze calm. Kiro followed, noiseless as always, his eyes never leaving hers. And last came Maple, the one who always seemed to know the rhythm of someone else's worry, pressing her head lightly against Nova's hip as if to say, "We're ready, even if no one knows for what." Eli hadn't gone far. He had chosen to stop at a place where 2 old oak trees crossed, forming a natural X. No map marker, just a signal that those who'd walked these woods before would know. An old watch point, used by patrolmen during storm-heavy seasons. He carried no weapon, just a copy of the document, a faded photo of him and Lena, standing shoulder to shoulder in the wreckage of a burning base, and a worn notebook, pages stained by time, where he had written the things no one else dared report, each line short, emotionless, the way he trained himself to trap truth before it turned into memory. When the first engine sound rose from behind the ridge, Eli didn't turn. He stepped back once, placed his hand against the bark of the rightmost tree, and looked forward, toward the bushes beginning to tremble with the rhythm of tires grinding into forest soil. 3 black SUVs emerged simultaneously, not with sirens, not with headlights, but as silent monoliths of dull steel rolling forward with the inexorability of a tide that bore no waves, but pressed with enough force to make the soil itself shiver. Their doors opened in perfect unison, and 5 figures stepped out, each clad in graphite-toned protective gear, each moving into position without haste, their eyes not inquisitive, but commanding, the way those who expect compliance do not need to search for consent. The one in front held a digital slate, its pale glow casting an artificial gleam across his face, which bore no expression, no trace of anticipation, only the weight of preloaded authority. "By directive of the National Asset Control Unit," he began, voice steady, flat, mechanical, "the biological entities classified under Batch 7M are being retrieved under Clause 32B of the National Secrecy Protocol." He extended the scanning device. Eli did not move. Instead, he undid the top button of his coat, reached into his breast pocket, and withdrew a weathered photograph, which he held out, not upward, not downward, but level, with a quiet steadiness born of old fires not yet extinguished. "Before you read the next sequence from that device," he said, "send this photo to your command center. And if the one who answers is Lena Ryers, tell her Eli Heron is standing in Grapevine Forest and has never forgotten the fire of 2006. The wind rushed suddenly through the trees, as if the forest itself had exhaled from its deepest root, carrying the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves and memories that had not been buried deeply enough to be forgotten. A minute later, the operative's phone rang. He answered without breaking eye contact with Eli, and after listening in silence, gave a slow, minimal nod. "Directive from Sheriff Ryers," he said. "Nothing is to be retrieved until she arrives." 13 minutes later, a white pickup truck with local plates skidded to a stop at the edge of the clearing. A woman stepped down, wearing a short field coat, her hair graying at the edges from more than just the cold, one hand gloved, the other clutching a thick file folder. Lena Ryers, once suspended for refusing to sign the authorization to erase the 3rd training camp's records, now stood as sheriff of this district. No one knew exactly when she had returned, but Eli did. And so did she. For she had always known that Eli never truly stepped away from what they had once witnessed and never been able to unsee. Lena approached without greeting, without handshake. She looked straight into the eyes of the man holding the command board. "Recall orders have not cleared triple verification," she said, voice unshaken, as steady as it had once been reading verdicts in an old military tribunal. "They are not property, and if you insist on proceeding, I have the authority to enact a temporary restriction order under the Community Safety Clause." The man said nothing. Behind him, one of the soldiers placed a hand lightly on the strap of his holster. And at that moment, Rune stepped out from the forest's edge. Not growling, not leaping, just walking. His eyes locked with the man's in a stillness so dense it seemed to stop the air, and in that brief silence, something within the operative's nervous system seemed to twitch, not in fear, but in recognition, as if a memory long buried had just been touched by something that remembered it better than he did. Rune stopped in front of Eli, raised his head, then turned to look at Lena. She gave a slow nod. "Withdraw your unit. 3 days, I'll personally verify the legitimacy of every order tied to Batch 7M. The 3 SUVs turned as one, their tires churning up the softened earth, leaving behind deep, crooked tracks like tangled threads on old parchment, marks no administrative reversal could ever truly erase. As Lena turned back toward her truck, she paused beside Eli. 3 days, Eli. Just 3. Eli nodded, his gaze following the receding tire marks that disappeared into the edge of the trees. Nova stepped forward and laid a hand gently on his shoulder. She didn't speak. Maple stood close by, looking upward into the pale sky. A lone bird cut across the thinning clouds, and at the horizon, something black grew steadily larger. Not a vehicle, not a man. Eli squinted, tracking its blurred trajectory, then turned and walked back toward the house. The old house, where the side door still stood ajar, and the firelight from within flickered against the dark grain of the wooden table. He climbed the stairs to the attic, a place he had once sworn never to return to, not since the day he buried his father, a space that had once been the domain of a man who wore white shirts, black leather watches, and wrote his journals in blue ink. Inside, there was less dust than he remembered. Only the scent of old wood, the weight of damp paper, and the soft echo of his own footsteps moving across the planks above the ceiling. A small desk stood by the window, beside it the old armchair with the burn mark from when, as a child, he had spilled an oil lamp in the dark. But what made Eli stop was the olive-colored metal box nestled in the far corner, exactly where a thin beam of sunlight pierced through the cracked roof, reflecting off a faint embossed emblem on the lid. Eli opened it. Inside were neatly arranged folders sealed in plastic, each labeled in the meticulous handwriting of his father. No smudges, No tremors. Configuration classified. Gene mapping / Project Aegis / Phase 4, A, Lot H7M. He opened the first file. A photo of a male dog. Sleek black coat, eyes intelligent but withdrawn. Beneath the photo, a note. Helix, ID code G4776. Breeder, Connor Vexley. Project, Advanced Field Response Unit, Phase 3. The second page was a battle map, marking an area labeled Marrow Fields, engagement date 17.2, the site where Helix had leapt into wreckage to reach a soldier trapped beneath a collapsed steel girder, and the place he never returned from. But one thing Eli had never known was this. The request for Helix's body retrieval hadn't come from the military. It had come from his father. At the bottom of the report, a final line read, Request to preserve DNA sample G4776. Store at Southridge Lab, by personal request, Heron T. Eli sank slowly to the floor, the file still in his hands that didn't shake but closed tightly, as if everything that once defied understanding now stood more vivid than language could hold. A faint sound came from behind him. Rune stepped inside, no sound from his feet on the floor. He looked at Eli, then approached, lowered his head, and gently laid his chin on Eli's knee, not questioning, not fearful, just watching, still and deep, like a stream that remembered the mountains it came from. Eli placed his hand on Rune's head. It wasn't fur he felt. It was something else, something newly named, a connection between a creature just saved and a life once lived, once sacrificed, once named Helix. Nova climbed the stairs. The glow from her phone lit her face as she opened a data file, its screen showing a location trace linked to Helix's preserved DNA. "There's a place," she whispered, as if not to break the silence holding the space between Eli and Rune. "Called Southridge, but it's no longer part of any government system." Rune turned his head, eyes gliding across the screen, then back to Eli. He didn't bark. He didn't move. But his tail gave a single, quiet wag, not rushed, not idle, but timed with perfect stillness, as Nova read the line at the very bottom. Proposal to reconstruct autonomous behavioral reflex. Trial approval pending substitute specimen. Suggestion, Generation 7M. Outside, the clouds began to part. A narrow beam of sunlight fell across the steps of the porch, where Cairo now sat, head tilted slightly, eyes watching the house, as if he too had just heard a story that had never been told aloud. And somewhere beneath the floor of the attic, behind the warped plank near the base of the wall, a soft click echoed. A sound not made by paper. A sound that did not belong to records, not a memory, but something still waiting beneath. Nova leaned forward, fingertips gently brushing the warped edge of the wooden floorboard. The last light of day filtered through the small window above, casting a muted trail of dust between the close walls of the shuttered room. She pulled out a slim box, light in her hand, and inside it rested a hard drive labeled log_V7-personal/Heron T. She didn't need to ask Eli. She already knew this didn't exist in any military registry. The date scrawled in faded ink on the case matched the day Eli's father had died, and the code etched in the corner was something that had never appeared in any publicly archived system. When the drive powered up, Eli glanced at her, not in fear, not in resistance, but like someone watching a younger soul walk the final steps of a path he had once only half dared to tread. No one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of cooling fans and the whirring of an aging machine. Then the screen blinked, slowly revealing an icon, a scratched-out eye, the long-forgotten mark of an unauthorized surveillance mode. A blurred video clip came to life. The frame shook gently, unfocused. Inside a gray-tiled room, 5 dogs were tethered to steel mounts. On the identification board, Batch 7M. Behind the glass, a man stood in a white coat, clipboard in hand. Connor Vexley. His face wasn't cruel. It wasn't cold. It was simply detached, like someone checking the quality of a project nearing completion. But then came the simulated explosion. 4 dogs lunged toward the combat dummy, reacting as they were trained to. Only one remained still, turned slowly, and looked back toward the camera. That dog was Kiro. Nova paused the playback. Eli stood and walked to the window, gazing across the distant valley, where the hill known as Aegis had once been the heart of tactical training for K-9 units. Now, only broken concrete slabs and rusted warning signs remained. "We have to go public," Nova said. No one disagreed. That night, Nova began building the first video. It wasn't an exposé, not an accusation, not a political statement. It was a story, told through images, through silence, through eyes. She titled the video, "We Are Not Broken." 3 names appeared on the screen: Rune, Maple, Kiro. Then came the cuts, Rune lying quietly by the rain-streaked door, Maple tilting her head to the rhythm of Nova's heartbeat, Kiro scratching softly at the cabin wall, exactly where he had first seen Eli's silhouette emerge from the shadows of Grey Pine. When it was uploaded, no one knew what might come of it. But by morning, Eli checked his phone. The first alert, 20,000 views. By midday, 76,000. By sundown, the comments flooded in, hundreds, not just from strangers, but from former K-9 unit members, retired rescue workers, field medics who had once bandaged wounded dogs on the outskirts of Mosul, and from a mother who wrote, "My son died in the blast, but that dog came back. I know because I still keep the dried blood on its collar." Nova sat in front of the screen, unable to read them all, but each word felt like it landed not on her keyboard, but into the soil beneath their feet. Outside, Rune lifted her head, ears tilting toward the small antenna bolted above the porch, where a fragile Wi-Fi signal was now carrying a story no one had ever paused long enough to hear. The sunset spilled red across the low-hung clouds. Eli stepped onto the porch, where Kiro lay, front legs stretched, head resting along the wooden stairs edge. Not alert, not guarded, but for the first time, completely still, as if he finally believed that closing his eyes didn't mean losing everything again. And at that exact moment, Nova's screen lit up. A call, no contact name, just 4 digits, 7743. Not an area code, not a command center extension, just a sequence, once used in Aegis's internal encryption protocols. The screen vibrated slightly. Then a line of text appeared. "If you remember Echo Station, come back, not for the 3 dogs, for the ones still waiting their turn." Nova brought her hand to her mouth, not to quiet herself, but to hold back the swell of emotion that rose too fast. There was no threat in the message, but it felt like a door had creaked open, revealing the first light from a room someone had locked behind layers of fractured trust. Jaden, half leaning over the desk, stared at the screen, his fingers trembling faintly above the keys. "This isn't from a public server," he whispered. "It was sent through a temporary gate, already closed. It can't be traced, but—" "But what?" Nova asked. "But that system was once used to upload Batch 7M data before the entire history was scrubbed from the archive." The room fell silent, broken only by the whisper of the small desk fan and the distant hum of a world still unaware that, right now, a new wave was taking shape in the shadows. Eli stepped inside, eyes landing on the message. Then, quietly, he placed a newspaper on the table. On the front page, a still from Nova's video. Headline in bold: "The Truth About the Abandoned Warriors." He said nothing, just reached over to the curtain on the right side of the room, drawing it slightly open to let in the last streaks of evening light, illuminating the wooden wall where Rune now lay, eyes half closed, ears still tracking Jaden's keystrokes. Across the room, Maple stretched out, resting her chin on Nova's leg. Not moving, not seeking anything, just being there, still and certain, like a period at the end of a sentence not yet finished. Online, the video was moving faster than anyone in the group had dared to expect. Comments piled up by the minute. Former members of the K9 program began sharing it, some posting photos, others recounting stories, even uploading clips of old news segments that had once been buried under algorithmic suppression. Like puzzle pieces drifting back into orbit, the fragments began forming something larger. Among the comments, a short video appeared, tagged by an anonymous account, labeled with only one word: "Reclaim." It was under 40 seconds long. A soldier's voice, his face unseen, the footage captured from a helmet cam. "I was one of the few who deployed the 7Ms. I watched Kiro take a bullet for a downed soldier. I watched Rune guide us through smoke when GPS failed. I watched Maple claw at a locked base door to alert rescue for an entire trapped unit. Don't say they're system errors. If there's a flaw, it's with whoever wrote the rules." No name, no face, just a voice. But the video spread, shared by dozens, then hundreds of users. Soon, it aired again, this time in a televised exclusive, as major networks shifted their angle from public safety concern to moral reckoning. Vexley responded swiftly. A letter was filed with City Hall, accusing Eli Heron of harboring behaviorally non-compliant biological assets, posing risk to public safety. But this time, the backlash didn't come from legal offices. It came from the public. Over 10,000 signatures flooded in within 6 hours, demanding an open investigation into the Aegis program. Post after post surfaced. Personnel files, training layouts, behind-the-scenes footage leaked by former staff. Every scrap unearthed another layer of a buried collective memory, shaken loose by a truth no longer content to sleep. Eli said little. He just picked up a highlighter, orange, and circled a line in the file Jaden was compiling. The first, Connor Vexley, with a note scribbled beside, "Temporarily suspended after a training incident involving psychological trauma to 3 subjects in Group 6N. The second circle, "No record of transfer." And the final line, handwritten, not printed, read, "Helix, father of Kiro, missing after mission at North Point. No death ever confirmed." Jaden's hand paused mid-motion. He looked up slowly, the light catching in his eyes. "So, if he's still alive?" Eli did not reply. He simply closed the folder with a quiet finality, then turned toward the old radio, switching it on. The static crackled to life, the frequency unstable, drifting like a hand reaching in the dark for a signal that had never been meant to be found, a channel buried beneath layers of silence and time. Nova stepped onto the porch. Rune followed, not directly beside her but a few paces behind, as if maintaining a respectful distance out of instinct rather than instruction. The sun had reached the lip of the hill, its last light bending across the horizon, and in that faint glow a fine veil of dust had begun to rise, not from wheels, not from wind, but from something else entirely, something moving toward them with no sound, yet leaving behind a trace as precise as a scar on timber torn by claws of something that never intended to turn back. Rune stopped beside the porch beam. His ears stood alert, and his eyes, for the first time, not on Nova, but fixed ahead, unblinking, trained on the field where the last rays of daylight kissed the tips of the grass like a warning too soft to speak aloud. From the radio in Eli's hand came a low, wavering buzz, stretching out like breath held too long. And then, a voice, rough and calm, emerging from a depth of memory where things are buried, not forgotten. We never withdrew. We were only waiting for the next order. The federal hearing room was smaller than most imagined. Not the grand halls of film, not the kind of place flooded with light from above or punctuated by made-for-television gasps, but a space of quiet textures and old tension, of brown fabric benches, pale oak paneling, and the soft, rhythmic turn of pages, like leaves falling in a forest no one had thought to listen to. Nova sat upright, hands folded, eyes forward. Behind her, Cairo lay without leash or muzzle, only a gray silk band tied loosely around his neck, as if to mark that this witness was not merely human, and this testimony not spoken from a single species. Her voice didn't tremble, though the first breath she took sat longer in her lungs than expected. "I don't know who created them," she said, "but I know who abandoned them, and I know—" She paused, eyes shifting toward the far side of the table. "I know Kiro is still alive because he chose to believe not all humans are the same." A man in the first row leaned slightly, the badge on his lapel catching a shard of light. Deputy Director of Internal Oversight, the same official who had signed the order suspending the Aegis program 4 years ago, now seated in silence, hearing its name spoken not as a covert designation, but as a chapter of truth reopened. The projection screen came to life. An image, pulled from the viral video, "We Are Not Broken." Rune, standing in the sun, his head bowed toward Nova, Maple by the window, his gaze distant, as if waiting for something to return from the horizon. Eli did not look at the screen. He opened a letter. Handwritten, familiar ink, faded but intact, each line carrying a rhythm that no one else could replicate. "My father once wrote," Eli said, voice level and unhurried, "No being is born to obey. Only the strong choose to serve." He wrote that in 1997, after an explosion at North Point, when a K9 ran into rubble without waiting for a signal. That dog's name was Helix, and he was Kiro's father. No one interrupted, no coughs, no pen taps, only silence. And Rune, stepping forward from the rear of the room, entered the space between rows and simply stood, neither growling nor reacting, but holding presence as if he understood that his being here, right now, was the only testimony that needed to be given. When it came time for Aegis's legal representative to speak, the lights shifted to a secondary screen, displaying in sharp type, "Lot 7M record, behavioral rejection, subject to safe disposal protocol." They played the footage, segments of code, evaluation metrics, failure thresholds, data reducing the complexity of life into lines and numbers, as if the worth of any being could be captured in integers and charts. But then, a new video filled the screen. Cairo, carrying a fevered child across an ice-covered road, eyes fixed on the camera. No words spoken, none needed. Because in that frame, no defense could drown out what had already been understood. Jaden, the young hacker, was called forward. He held a portable device showing restructured data, decoded from the original training system. His finger tapped a single sequence. "This signal was hidden," he said. "A sub-layered structure, like a low-tier reflex. It's not a malfunction. It's a defense mechanism, activated just before forced collapse." A council member leaned forward. "You're saying they're not malfunctioning?" Jaden looked up. "No. They're resisting, and they're still alive." Eli closed the letter. His eyes did not return to the council. They turned to the back of the room, where Nova now stood beside 3 collars, laid out carefully on a bare wooden table. Rune remained at her side. This time Maple stepped forward to join him. Kiro did not look at anyone. He raised his head toward the narrow open window, toward the sound of a car pulling up outside. The door opened, not loud, but unmistakable. And in walked an older woman, silver-haired, her badge reading, Dr. Lorraine Merkel, Chief of Behavioral Veterinary Sciences, 1999 to 2005. No one had summoned her, but she carried a framed photograph, edges worn, corners soft, a picture of a dog like Rune standing beside an orphaned child after the Northern Bridge collapse in 2002. She didn't speak much. She placed the photograph on the council table, and then, quietly, I think we were wrong. Not a system failure. A system that never asked them what they wanted. Outside, the live feed of the hearing's final moments was still streaming. The view count had surpassed every forecast from the broadcast agency. And pinned at the top of the comment thread, by the official account of the Federal Investigation Bureau, was a single new message. Hearing suspended. Special session. Lookout station. Reconvenes tomorrow. This time the witnesses will not all be human. The room was not large. Off-white walls, low tables of brushed metal, and two one-way mirrors facing one another. On one side stood Nova, holding the initial results. On the other, Eli beside a touch screen, displaying real-time behavior analysis. Every step, every glance, every breath converted into data that pulsed like thought captured in digital form. Kiro entered first. No hesitation, no glance around. He walked to the far corner of the room and stopped in front of a small wooden box turned slightly on its side. Inside, a fragment of cloth, once used to wrap Nova's hand during the first rainstorm. The fabric had long since dried. No scent remained, no trace of blood, no imprint of touch. Yet Kiro stood still for 5 seconds. Then he lowered his nose, inhaled once, and turned toward the signal reader. A thin line of green light flared on the screen. Trace accuracy to unknown scent sequence, 98.6%. Outside the observation glass, a technician sucked in a breath through his teeth, as if even he couldn't believe the number he had just witnessed. Maple was the second to enter. Unlike Kiro, Maple stopped in the middle of the room, her ears gently folded back, as if waiting for a command not yet spoken. Then, from above, through the ceiling's embedded vents, sounds began to play. It wasn't a siren. It wasn't a voice calling out. It was a blend of sharp, dissonant fragments, a slamming door, the shriek of wind, the metallic drag of a chain across tile. And finally, a voice, so faint it barely slipped through the walls, but it did. "You'll never pass this test." Nova clenched the sheet of paper in her hand. She recognized that voice. It was part of the recovered training audio from Batch 7M's files. The voice of Vexley, once embedded into reflex conditioning protocols as part of their emergency override tests. Maple raised her head. Her ears lifted, and she didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't approach the speaker. Instead, she turned, quietly, firmly, and looked straight into the camera. Her eyes didn't carry defiance, nor avoidance. Just a soft, unwavering expression, as though she had heard those words 100 times before and now knew there was no longer any need to respond. Across the screen, a line appeared. Auditory threshold response analyzed, stability confirmed, emotional treatment marker, qualified, low-frequency acoustic sensitivity, index 93.2%. Rune entered last. No harsh light, no cue, just a single chair placed at the center of the room, and seated in it, not a doctor, not a handler, but a child, a girl, 10 years old. Her name was Liza. She had stopped speaking after surviving a fire. She wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. No one had told Rune she would be there. The door closed. Rune stepped forward, each movement deliberate, unhurried, as though every inch traversed was a word spoken in a language that didn't require sound. He didn't rush, Didn't wag, didn't raise a paw. He simply sat. The distance between them, just one breath apart. The girl didn't turn, but her eyes began to blink more often, as if holding something in her chest that hadn't yet found a way out. 17 minutes passed. No words were spoken, no motion logged, just a touch, gentle and barely perceptible, from her small palm resting on Rune's back. No system recorded it, no graph displayed it. But outside the room, Eli spoke, voice low. That's the only kind of response that doesn't need measuring. On the drive back, the rain came light and rhythmic, soft droplets tapping across the roof like someone sketching the memory of a heartbeat once lost in a broken dream. Nova sat in the back seat with the three beings, no longer test subjects, no longer numbers, but living waypoints, survivors of stations no one else had ever learned to name. She took out her phone and reopened the hidden video. We are not broken. This time, not to rewatch it, but to rewrite its ending. She added one final line. Their wounds never changed who they were. They only made it clearer what we should have called them from the beginning. Comrades. At a small gas station near the eastern gate, where they stopped under full nightfall, Maple suddenly jumped down from the vehicle, darting toward the corner of the fence. Kiro and Rune didn't react. Nova didn't panic, because through the veil of mist and amber streetlight, a figure was walking toward them from a parked freight truck in the distance. Tall, wrapped in a weather-worn coat, a leather satchel slung across one shoulder, a satchel that matched the one from the decades-old Echo Station archive image. The figure moved slowly, and on the lapel of that coat, a circular badge caught the light. The old insignia of the Western branch of the Bioethics Command Unit. Graypine High School's courtyard wasn't large, but that morning every tiled square had been carefully scrubbed, each chair arranged in neat rows, facing a wooden podium covered in gray cloth. From every forest path around town, coats of dark fabric began arriving, their wearers quiet but purposeful. No public announcement had been made, no official notice issued. Yet everyone had come. Under the soft late spring sunlight, old firefighters stood beside former battlefield nurses and retired officers. Some clutched faded leather leashes, buckles worn thin with time. In the corner of the courtyard, 3 eighth graders had pinned a large banner across the fence. Names returned. The handwriting was uneven, but the brushstrokes were bold, like a promise no one had been asked to make, but everyone chose to keep. Nova stepped forward to the podium. In her hand was a paper, folded into thirds, its edges crinkled from how tightly she had held it all morning. She didn't read from it. She lifted her eyes, and below, the 3 beings sat quietly. No cues, no commands, no instruction, but still and composed, as if they knew the role they held in a ceremony that would never be recorded in any official town ledger. The first, Nova began, is a soul who never stopped searching when the scent of loss was thick with ash. She stepped down, gently resting her hand atop Kiro's head. His name is Kiro, the one who guards the truth inside memories no one else remembers how to smell. The applause wasn't loud, but it was even. Each person, it seemed, speaking quietly to themselves through their palms. The second, she continued, never barked, never defied, but knew exactly where silence was needed and where listening began. She turned to the right, knelt beside Maple. Maple, the one who translated the sounds long buried beneath louder noise. A glint of sunlight caught her coat, briefly lighting it like a brushed wing of metal before fading back into air. And finally, Nova turned again, more slowly this time, eyes landing on Rune, once afraid of light, once shy of any gaze, but now he lifted his head. Is the one who never spoke, never howled, yet somehow knew how to calm a heart with nothing but a single touch. Rune, the keeper of rhythm for hearts that never learned how to beat steady. Eli stepped forward. In his hand, 3 crescent-shaped badges wrapped in circles, the retired insignia of the special unit that once studied therapy dogs in the late 1990s, long since reduced to archived footnotes. He knelt, quietly clipping each one to the collars now fastened again around the necks of the 3. No oaths were sworn, no flags were raised, just the presence of those who knew exactly what had been broken. And now, perhaps, what had finally begun to mend. But after that single moment, quiet yet unmistakably profound, one by one, people in the crowd began to raise their hands, not in greeting, not in applause, but simply to place them over their left chest, over the place where breath once stirred or still did, where memory lingered, where each had, at some point in their life, been rescued or waited for, or quietly trusted by a being that never needed words to be understood. The small gathering began not with grand music, nor the crackle of fireworks, but with the aroma of warm pastries, the soft clink of ceramic cups filled with fresh coffee, and the simple brush of hands across napkins as fragmented stories found their way back into voice between the pauses needed to wipe away the mist from someone's eyes. Nova sat beside Maple, listening to Kiro sniffing gently around the base of the chairs, while Rune rested his head against the back of a little girl, tracing her fingers over the faint scars still healing on his fur. Not afraid of the texture, but comforted by it, as if it told her she wasn't alone in being marked by something that didn't win. Eli stood next to Lena, now honored as the ceremonial commander of the Grey Pine Emergency Response Unit, his gaze drawn toward the edge of the distant forest, to the place where one great tree had long since fallen, but whose roots still clung stubbornly to the soil as if to remind the world that what once stood tall never disappears entirely. Spring had returned in whispers, breezes soft and cool threading through the slats of the cabin roof, sinking into the warm soil beneath the modest training shelter recently built out back. Not with government funds or institutional banners, but from the slow and steady contributions of townspeople who had once watched the news, who had once raised their hands to their chests when the names Rune, Maple, or Cairo were read aloud. Not as reports, but as echoes of something they hadn't forgotten. On the first morning of the trial training cycle, Eli sat on the porch steps, holding a ceramic mug of tea, watching as Rune tracked Nova's movement across the gravel yard. Not tethered, not commanded, but following with nothing more than a look exchanged and understood. Kiro stood at the front of the line, wearing a red rescue harness embroidered with the insignia of the new civilian search unit, his eyes blinking in rhythm with the clear, crisp instructions from the young firefighter. A recent recruit still finding his voice, but speaking now with the quiet conviction that came from knowing Kiro didn't need to be taught how to find people. He only needed a reason to begin. Maple, still holding on to the habit of tilting her head each time a door opened, had been officially assigned to the Woodpine Senior Home, where she now moved gently alongside walkers and wheelchairs, resting her muzzle in the open palms of elders who no longer remembered their own names, but still instinctively recalled how to stroke the back of a being who asked for nothing but presence. No one had taught Maple how to heal, but she could do it, simply by being there. Rune had been granted a special companion pass, a laminated card clipped to the strap of Nova's school bag, stamped with the approval of the Gray County Therapeutic Integration Program. Nova attached it to his collar that morning, right outside her classroom door, and the homeroom teacher, after glancing only briefly at the printed name Rune Elian Heron, simply nodded, not because it met protocol, but because something deeper in her understood. Throughout the first school day, Rune lay at the back of the classroom, beside Nova's desk. never moving, never drawing attention, only occasionally lifting his head when a classmate reached out to run a hand along his spine or leaned over to whisper a question barely louder than breath. "Can he hear what we're feeling?" Rune didn't nod. He didn't bark. But a boy, once diagnosed with functional mutism, silent for 2 full years, placed his hand on Rune's back, then smiled for the first time since. That same afternoon, as the forest behind Eli's house received the wind like a choir through its leaves, Nova stood by the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa, her gaze unfocused, but her heart quietly brushing against something it could not name, something that had been growing every day since. It wasn't healing that came from medication, nor obedience summoned by training, but something older, something born from the beings once declared no longer fit for service. From the corner of the kitchen, a voice rose from the old radio, part static, part certainty, as the local broadcast announced new files under reevaluation. Among them, 9 additional K9 records, formerly classified under unknown batches, awaiting review with no confirmed record of previous handlers. Eli said nothing. He simply pulled out another wooden chair, placing it gently near the porch railing, where the last beam of sunlight now touched the first pine bough. Rune stepped outside. Maple stretched. Kiro rose with quiet resolve. No call was given. No lead was taken. They simply walked together toward the light fading beneath the trees. Not everyone hears the whisper of the forest, but though in the heart of a snow-covered morning the blind old man followed memory's rhythm along a path he had once known by heart. But with just one misplaced tap of his cane, his body slid down an icy slope, disappearing into the depths of the forest. As hope seemed to vanish beneath the heavy fog, warm breaths emerged, 6 of them, encircling him in silence, each step softly imprinting the snow. A pack of wolves had arrived, and at the center, a familiar gaze was drawing near. That gaze had vanished in a storm 7 years ago, yet its return now carried something the old man never could have expected. The sun had yet to rise, but inside the small wooden cabin by the edge of Halberd Forest, the warmth still lingered on the thick wool blanket. Everything in that space had its place, arranged with a precision that bordered on reverence. A cup of water sat at the edge of the table. A chair with a folded throw blanket rested near the fireplace. A walking stick leaned precisely against the left side of the front door. It was like an invisible map, etched not on paper, but in the memory of a man who could no longer see the light. Rowan Hale woke as he did every morning. His face bore deep lines of age, but none of hardship. His hair was almost entirely silver, thin and tousled after a long night, but his hands remained steady as he folded the blanket and moved toward the wood stove, guided only by memory to warm a kettle. For Rowan, the world did not exist through images anymore. It came alive through sounds, scents, and the rhythm of its breath. A breeze slipping through the doorframe was enough for him to know the wind had changed. A soft thud of snow on the porch told him the forest had been gifted a new layer of white. He had lived alone here for nearly 9 years. The cabin rested where the forest thinned and the ground began to rise, a quiet sign that the frozen hills stood just beyond. Rowan had once been a meteorological engineer, a man fluent in the language of clouds, cold, and moisture, until an accident took his sight. Life after that shrank into something smaller, but it never felt empty. He kept living, not just surviving, but learning every shift of the nature that surrounded him. After sipping warm water and wrapping a wool scarf around his neck, Rowan quietly opened a wooden drawer at the foot of his bed. Inside was an object he carried with him every single day, even though there was no real reason to do so anymore. A brown leather leash, worn at the corners, with a rusted metal clasp on one end. His fingers brushed across the folded creases of the strap, then closed tightly around it in his right hand. His left reached for the walking stick near the door. Rowan opened the door. A rush of cold air swept in, puffing the scarf around his neck like a layer of armor. Snow was falling lightly, and the morning air still felt gentle. But he knew that in just a few hours, a sharp wind would come down from the northern ridges, turning Halberd Forest into a blank page of white. Still, like every morning, he stepped outside. Not for anyone. Not for anything grand. Simply because his legs still worked. And the forest was still breathing. Every step was measured by the rhythm of his stick tapping the snow-covered ground. 3 steps to the pine tree with the broken crown, 5 more to the stone covered in moss. That was how he saw the path. He didn't need light to follow the trail that ran along the forest's edge, where every branch, every rock had been memorized over the years. The leash stayed in his hand, gently swaying with each step, as if he were still walking someone, something, that had once been an inseparable part of mornings like this. Sable. That name had never left his mind, no matter how many years had passed. A German shepherd, intelligent, calm, and fiercely brave. No one could count the number of times Sable had saved him, from wild animal traps to slips on icy slopes. But that wasn't what Rowan remembered most. It was Sable's eyes, during quiet nights by the stove, when the wind rattled the windows, and neither of them needed to speak to know they weren't alone. A powerful storm that year had separated them. Sable vanished into the woods while Rowan struggled to hold the cabin door against the roaring wind. When the storm cleared, he searched, for weeks, feeling his way through every trail. But the snow had wiped out all traces. Since then, every morning, he still brought the leash, not to search, but as a way to keep her close, at least within the rhythm of his breath. This morning, Rowan sensed the wind shifting sooner than usual. The chill cut through his thick coat. He paused beside an old yew bush, catching the scent of pine sap in the air, then continued along the familiar path. A branch to his left dropped a dusting of snow onto his shoulder, a sign that a squirrel had just leapt past. He smiled. Nature always speaks to those who learn how to listen. But today, something felt different. The wind carried a strange scent. It was damper, colder, but not the scent of ice. It was something alive, close, and moving. Rowan stopped, listened. The walking stick tapped the snow. Once, then again. No echo, no rustling leaves. Only the soft thump of his heartbeat in his chest, and a faint trace of breath on the breeze that did not belong to the wind or the earth, but to something waiting. He tightened his grip around the leash, not out of fear, just a feeling, like an ordinary morning had quietly slipped off its usual track. Every morning in the forest carried its own story, but Rowan didn't know that this morning would be the last one he ever truly believed he was alone. And it would be the morning when snow stopped being just snow and became the first page of something no language could ever fully describe. The stick in Rowan's hand continued to tap steadily against the snow-covered ground, each step a quiet measurement between memory and instinct. He was still on the familiar path, or so he thought, until that moment. A sudden gust of wind swept down from the north, scattering snow into a blinding haze. He strained his ears, but heard only the brittle snap of branches colliding in the cold. No squirrels, no morning bird song, only a thick, pressing silence. And then, in an instant, his walking stick no longer struck the solid, packed snow. Its tip had touched something smooth, too late to pull back. His left foot slid. Then the rest of his body followed. No sound escaped his lips. His aged frame reacted slowly, but muscle memory from a life once active tried to coil him into a safer shape. He slipped down an icy slope, blind to where it led, feeling only the speed building beneath him. Snow scoured his back. Twigs lashed across his face. Something hit his knee hard, twisting his body sideways. When he finally stopped, there was only silence again. Rowan lay curled in a narrow hollow between two boulders, breath shallow. His stick was gone. The leather leash had flung out of his hand and now rested a few steps away. The wind still howled, but now it echoed from multiple directions, bouncing off uneven rock. He was surrounded, enclosed, and most of all, somewhere unfamiliar. Bracing his arms, Rowan pushed himself upright. His limbs trembled but held. His head had struck something on the way down. No blood, just a dizzying throb. One knee ached with a slow, spreading pain, but it wasn't enough to keep him from standing. His gloved hands searched the ground for grip. The snow here was deeper, softer. It gave way under his weight. Branches lay scattered, and there were no signs of the trail he once knew. No pine with a missing crown. No moss-covered stone. Nothing. He exhaled, his breath curling into the cold air like smoke. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out an old phone. It still had battery, a rare thing in this kind of cold. But the screen showed the same message it always had in these woods. No signal. He snapped it shut, held it in his hand for a few silent seconds before slipping it back into the inside pocket, as if keeping hope close to his chest might help him take one more step. Getting up was the hardest part. He ran his left hand along the nearest rock wall, searching for leverage to lift himself. Every motion pulled at the sharp ache in his knee. But still, he stood, not by strength, but by the understanding that if he didn't stand, there would be no path forward at all. He found the leash, the only familiar object in this confusion. When his hand closed around the rusted clasp, something pulsed faintly inside him. It wasn't clear, it wasn't loud, just a whisper in the wind. Enough to steady him, enough to keep fear from settling in. Rowan began walking. No destination, just away from where he fell. He needed to feel the ground return to a rhythm he could understand. But after only a few dozen steps, he stopped. The wind had grown stronger, and what he heard now wasn't just wind. It layered. There were twigs snapping, snow falling from high branches, and something else. Footsteps. Light, very light, but many. Not uneven like a person walking, more like a rhythm, surrounding him. He stood still. For the first time in years, Rowan had no idea where he was. Not because he was blind, but because nothing around him belonged to the map he had memorized by heart. Above, the snowfall thickened. Big flakes now. Dense, steady. No longer the gentle morning drift, but a curtain of white smothering all sounds, all tracks. Rowan heard no birds, no squirrels, only wind, and the way it brushed against something unseen ahead. He knew if he kept moving without direction, the forest's snow maze would only draw him deeper. But if he stayed, the cold would drain the last of his strength. Thoughts collided in his mind like unformed drumbeats. Somewhere among them, a faint voice surfaced. If only there were a familiar footprint to follow. He gripped the leash tighter, kept walking. He didn't know if he was headed in the right direction, didn't know what was waiting. But he trusted the one thing he had left, instinct. What he didn't know was that just ahead, buried in the thick snowdrifts, there was a footprint not made by a human, fresh, distinct, and facing his way. Rowan kept stepping slowly through the deepening snow. The old leash in his hand had turned stiff with frost, each metal clink against his stick or a stone beneath the surface, ringing like a memory, not just of direction, but of something he'd never dared to name aloud. 7 winters ago, during another season cold enough to make the world feel like it had stopped breathing, Rowan met Sable for the first time. That day, the wind shifted suddenly, and the weather alert issued a red warning. An ice storm was expected to sweep across the Halberd Range within hours. Back then, Rowan still had enough sight to recognize light, and he had rushed to leave the meteorological station to get back to his cabin early. But as he passed a narrow path between 2 ridges, he heard barking, not panicked, but purposeful. A call. The sound echoed faintly from a crevice half filled with snow. He approached and knelt down. Inside the gap, curled beneath loose snow, was a German Shepherd, shivering, her fur stiff with ice, one ear torn, muzzle swollen, her eyes wide, not pleading, but waiting. No collar, no chip. Perhaps a lost military dog. Perhaps a rescue canine left behind. But what kept Rowan from walking away was her gaze. Steady, cold even, but never resigned. As if she still believed someone would find her. Rowan wrapped her in his coat and carried her silently back to the cabin. That night, he boiled water, massaged her frozen legs, and warmed milk over the fire. When she stirred and looked up at him, her ears lowered instinctively, signaling trust and safety. Only then did he whisper, "Your coat's dark, like ash. I'll call you Sable." Somehow, the moment he spoke that name, the cabin felt warmer. She didn't bark. She simply pressed her head gently against his chest. From that day on, the wooden cabin was no longer quiet. Each morning, when Rowan reached for his cane, she was already waiting by the door. On afternoons when the snow melted, the sound of her paws on wet earth mixed with the wind chimes on the porch like spring's arrival, knocking gently. Rowan never trained her with commands, but Sable always knew what he needed, before he ever said a word. When he struggled up a slope, she stood waiting at the very spot he often slipped. When he forgot where he left his cane, she would nudge his leg and lead him there. It wasn't just a bond between man and dog. It was a silent presence, as if a piece of his soul had learned to walk again through her steps. And then, one day, on a morning when the wind turned wild just like today, Sable left the cabin before the storm hit. Rowan had been checking the porch roof for damage. She stood beneath the awning, staring at him for a long time. No barking, no pacing, just that steady gaze. And then, she vanished into the woods. He waited all night. At dawn, he searched. A few paw prints led him to the edge of a frozen lake, then disappeared into wind and snow. No blood, no scattered belongings, just an expanse of white so empty it ached. He searched for 2 weeks, posted notices, called out on the radio. But everything quieted, like the hush of melting snow. People told him it made sense, that no matter how smart an animal was, once it returned to nature, it became wild again. But Rowan never believed that, because leashes don't just fall from a hand. And her final look wasn't a farewell, it was a promise. The wind howled louder through the deep woods. Back in the present, Rowan stopped beneath a twisted tree shaped like a crooked C, one he'd brushed his hand against many times on old walks. His fingers slid across the cracked bark and paused at a familiar dip, an old marker worn into his memory. But this time, it wasn't smooth. Something caught against his glove. Software long, like a strand of fur. He gently plucked it free, brought it to his nose. A familiar scent drifted in, the smell of old rain, of something known, of Sable, Rowan stood still. The leash in his hand swayed gently, but this time he didn't feel alone. He stood beneath the bent tree, the strand of fur in his palm like a breath waiting to be spoken. Snow kept falling, fine and steady, dusting his hair with a soft, cold powder. He didn't move, not from exhaustion, but because something in the air had shifted. The wind still passed through, but no longer carried the rustle of leaves. It carried another kind of breath, heavier, deeper, alive, but not human. A sound that didn't rise from a throat or vocal cord, but from instinct, from somewhere older, buried in the primal map of nature. Rowan tapped his cane lightly against the snow. One beat, then another. No echo returned. But to the right, down a slope, the wind deflected off something with a strange, sudden change in direction. A living shape. Then came the growl. Low, undefined, not rushed, not aggressive, but a warning. Followed by another sound to his left. Another growl, different rhythm, not in unison. Rowan straightened, his grip on the leash tightened, clinging to that familiar rhythm as the forest around him seemed to shrink, breath by breath. He didn't need sight. He didn't need sound. His body knew. Wolves. 6. 6 wind currents. 6 bursts of breath rising into faint mist. 6 living presences encircling him in the blinding white. Rowan had spent years stationed at polar research outposts. He knew the tread of bears, the shuffling of gray deer, the scratching of snow mice burrowing under ice. Each creature moved with its own cadence. But only wolves carried this kind of presence. Unhurried, unafraid, unyielding. They didn't hide behind the bushes. They were present, as real and commanding as the darkness, as the wind, as the cold itself. Rowan tilted his head slightly, slowing his breath to listen. There were no footsteps, because the snow was thick enough to erase them. But he knew. The pack wasn't standing still. They were moving in a circle, each one keeping a deliberate distance, like it had been measured. Not close enough to provoke fear, not far enough to be ignored. And they were all silent. A kind of silence that spoke. No snarls, no howls, just the undeniable weight of presence. Rowan drew in a slow breath. His hands didn't shake. The cold was too familiar for that. But his skin began to register the moisture in the wind, not from snowfall, but from the breath of 6 living creatures. Then, a soft rustling behind him. Not the sound of deliberate steps, just the quiet brush of a large body against snow-covered undergrowth. He didn't turn, but he knew. One of them had drawn closer. His breathing stayed steady. And something strange rose within him. Not quite fear, not calm either, but the sharp awareness of being watched by eyes that didn't just see flesh, but read the breath itself. He spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you came to scare me, then message received." No reply, only the wind shifting lighter for a moment. But then, another growl, this time from directly in front of him, close, low and brief, like a confirmation. 6 wolves, surrounding him. But what surprised Rowan most was that they didn't attack. No charge, no sound breaking the formation. They just stood, holding their distance, watching. And in that moment, as the wind passed between tree trunks, Rowan remembered an afternoon long ago, back when Sable was still by his side. That day, while the two of them walked along the forest's edge to inspect a frozen spring, they had come face to face with a lone wolf. Sable didn't bark, didn't growl. She simply placed herself in front of him, eyes locked onto the other creature. The wolf hadn't advanced. It only stared at her for a long, wordless moment, then backed away and vanished into the woods. That day, Rowan had said something he still remembered. "You didn't speak, but somehow everyone knew you were asking them to stop." The feeling then was exactly what he felt now. 6 wolves, not charging, not hunting, but waiting. They weren't looking at him like prey. It was as if they were searching for something they once knew. Rowan stepped back half a pace, his boots pressed into snow softer than before. He sank slightly, but kept his balance. And then, a sound cut across the wind. Not like a wolf. It was sharper, quicker, a sound torn through the throat of another animal, less guttural, more exact. A bark, a single bark, no howling, no panic, just one clean, commanding note, sharp as an order. Rowan startled. That sound. Unmistakable. Sable. The bark sliced through the frozen air like an arrow, sharp and decisive, echoing across the vast white of Halberd's snow-covered forest. It wasn't the long wail of wolves. It wasn't the frantic cry of a cornered beast. It was a structured signal, a pulse of leadership, like the beat of a field drum once familiar in a life Rowan thought was long behind him. His body jolted, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that stirred in memory and shot down his spine like lightning through winter sky. The leash in his hand trembled, and then, through the pale curtain of mist ahead, a silhouette emerged. No touch was needed, no call required. Just the posture alone, low to the ground, forelegs anchored, head tilted slightly, ears raised and alert, was enough to awaken every instinct within him. A name, long buried, rose to the surface with unmistakable force. Sable. She stepped into the circle of snow, her gait no longer soft and fluid, but solid, like one who had crossed the wild alone, winter after winter. Her once glossy dark coat now bore streaks of gray along her spine, but her eyes, those eyes, had not changed. Still sharp, still aware, still remembering. She stood between Rowan and the wolves, not looking at him, but facing them. And in one quiet moment, she tilted her head slightly, her torn left ear folding softly, a silent greeting, before rising again, just as she used to when they lived in the old cabin. Rowan didn't speak. He stood frozen, not in fear, but in something harder to name. His eyes no longer saw, but his heart did, reading every line, every movement, every familiar detail brought back to life. Sable growled. Not a long growl, but one filled with memory, the memory of a trained rescue dog, taught to control chaos, to lead, to restore order in the midst of fear. The wolves paused. Each one, left, right, behind Rowan, stopped moving. No more growling, no more circling. Only a silence so sudden, so complete, it felt as if nature itself had been commanded to stillness. Rowan exhaled, a long, deep breath that seemed to carry the weight of 7 silent years. "Is it really you?" he whispered, almost not believing his voice could still form the words. Sable didn't turn around, but she stepped back just half a pace, her shoulder brushing gently against the tip of his cane, as if to answer without a sound. The wind still whistled through the pines, but it no longer bit. It no longer felt like he was lost in the wild. Instead, it felt like a sky had opened, a thread once broken, slowly weaving back together. One of the wolves across from them took a single step forward, not in aggression, but as if to move closer to her. Sable didn't growl. She simply lowered her stance, eyes locked onto the wolf's. It stopped, didn't flee, didn't bow. It just turned, quietly, and walked away, like one who had received an order without force. Rowan sank into the snow, his hand trembling, not from fear, but from something returned to him, whole as if it had never shattered. Sable turned to him then, truly this time. Her eyes held no suspicion, no trace of the wild, only the gaze of someone who had returned to the place they once belonged. He reached out, and his hand touched the snow-dusted fur along her shoulder, cold but soft. A breath escaped his lips, trembling. "Where have you been, all this time?" Sable pressed her forehead into his palm. No bark, no whimper, just a quiet, solid contact, an answer to all the lost years without speaking a word. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, the remaining 5 wolves stepped closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. They didn't bow. They didn't retreat. They simply circled, not to trap, but to surround, like beings drawn together by the same scent of memory. Rowan could feel every breath they exhaled, wisps of white mist rising from 6 steady lungs. None lunged. No claws scraped the snow. But every pair of eyes was on Sable, and she stood in the center, just like she once had, protecting pups that weren't hers, just like she once had, guarding the man who'd lost his eyes, but saved her from the cold. Rowan tilted his head, his lips quivering, but his voice came clear. "You're not alone. And they're not strangers." One of the wolves stepped forward and paused before him, lowering its head slightly. In the wild, it wasn't submission, it was recognition. Rowan understood. Inside that circle, he was no longer a man lost in the forest. He was the only one who had ever called her Sable, and had been called back. The wind softened. Not because the weather had shifted, but because something unspoken had settled into place, a new order between man and wilderness, one that required no language, no flag, no sound, just a single bark and a single stance. Rowan remained kneeling in the snow, his hand resting gently against the warmth of Sable's neck. His fingers reached the small scar near her shoulder, a faded line he used to stroke every night beside the fire. It was still there, just as it had been that night he first found her, buried in ice. No words passed between them, but he knew she had lived, not merely survived. She had lived to remember and lived to return. The wolves did not leave, but the formation shifted. Not a ring of threat, but one of protection. Each kept their respectful distance, neither approaching nor departing. Sable moved first. She stepped forward, one paw gliding over the snow, then stopped. She turned back, looked at him. No signal, no command. But in her eyes, he saw it clearly. She was asking him to follow. Rowan drew a deep breath and rose, using every bit of strength he had left. The cane stayed in his hand, but this time he wasn't navigating alone. Sable walked ahead, head low, ears alert to the forest's movements. A wolf flanked him on the right, another mirrored on the left. No one led him, they walked with him. The snow beneath his boots was thick, but no longer cruel. Between Sable's tracks and the wolves' paw prints, he felt warmth, as if the memory of the cabin and the wind through the window that winter long ago had returned, not as a dream, but as something real. After a while, Sable stopped. Ahead lay a sunken patch of ground where crooked trees tangled together, coated in pale moss. At first glance, it was just a clump of brush, but Sable stepped forward and nudged aside a layer of brittle branches with her nose. A space appeared, a low, dry path tucked beneath the snow. Warmer. Sheltered. Rowan couldn't see it, but he recognized the scent of damp earth and something else, fur, familiar, not of wild wolves, but of memory, the scent of a place that had once been home. He crouched and let his hand trail along the smoothed stone at the entrance. His fingers touched a shallow carving, just a few uneven scratches etched into the rock. But he knew them instantly. This is where I built Sable her first shelter, back when she was still afraid of fire. A rustle behind him. One of the wolves stepped forward, carrying a long, dry branch. Not large, but clearly chosen. It laid it gently at Rowan's feet, then stepped back without looking back. Rowan smiled. No one had taught them to do that. But Sable once had, in those early days living beside him, when she silently dragged sticks home to build a windbreak without waiting for a command. Maybe they had learned from her. Sable lay down just outside the small den's entrance, her eyes still scanning the forest, but her ears now lowered. A sign of release, a quiet acknowledgement that she had arrived where she was meant to be. Rowan sat beside her, pulling a folded handkerchief from the pocket of his coat. Inside was something he had carried all these years, a piece of carved wood, rough but clear. Sable. He had once planned to hang it above the cabin door for her first birthday, but never got the chance. The storm that year had swept away those plans. Now he placed it in the snow, right in front of the den. No need to hang it, no need to carve more. Just placing it here was enough, for a name once shouted into the void to now come home to rest in the right place. Sable didn't react, but her eyes lingered on the wood for a long time. Then, slowly, she turned and gave his hand a gentle lick. Just once. But for Rowan, it was a touch deeper than any memory. The wolves began to lie down around them, not crowding, not on alert. Each kept a space, forming a quiet arc beneath the forest trees. No one gave a signal. But clearly this was no random arrangement. Rowan tilted his head toward the sky, where the snowfall had finally stopped. There was nothing remarkable about the gray sky above. Only that for the first time in 7 years, he didn't feel like he was standing alone in the forest. On the soft ground beneath Halberd's canopy, where wolves had settled in an unspoken pattern, Rowan remained still beside Sable. The wind had all but faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of nearby breaths, and a faint, wordless story beginning again through Sable's own breath. Rowan saw nothing, but in that moment, behind closed eyes, a memory lit up like the first flame in a frozen night. 7 years ago, after leaving the cabin, Sable had run straight down the forest slope, not out of panic, not driven by instinct to flee, but in answer to a call unlike anything she had ever heard. A whimpering howl, thin, broken, fragile, not loud, not urgent, but carrying something that struck the deepest part of her, like when a mother who has never birthed a child suddenly knows there is one waiting to be found. Sable pushed through the snowbound dark. The blizzard still cloaked the mountains. Ice clung to her fur. Her front paws scraped raw on stone, and the old tear in her ear reopened, bleeding from a bite during a dash past scavengers. But she didn't stop. She didn't know where she was going, only that the sound led her to the edge of a cliff. There, beneath a fallen tree, a narrow crevice lay between 2 slabs of rock, a wolf den. Inside, 6 tiny lives trembled. Wet fur, mud-caked skin. No mother. The blood scent at the entrance was fresh, the scent of an adult female wolf, perhaps their mother, now gone, either wounded too badly to return or already lost. The scent was fading, hope with it. Sable could have turned away. She was starving. She was cold. She was not their kind. But she didn't. Instead, she crawled in, slowly, pressing her body low to the ground so she wouldn't startle them. The 6 pups, still blind, recoiled as her breath reached them. But when she lay still, no bark, no move, pressing her bony chest into the cold floor, one came forward. Then another. Then all 6. She licked each one, nudged their tiny muzzles gently against her side. And from within her, a final flow of milk, remnants of a litter lost in the storm the year before, returned. Not because of biology, but because of something that lived above instinct. In the dark, Sable was not alone. She became a living flame. Small, but enough to warm 6 lives on the edge of extinction. Beside Rowan now, her breathing grew heavier. She was asleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. It was memory, retold through her breath. And Rowan understood. He could feel it, every step back from the hunt, every meal dragged into the den. Even the days when all she could find was a handful of ripe winter berries, she would split them, offering half. Every motion, every lick to a pup's face, every night she lay blocking the cold wind outside their shelter. It was all repeated like a silent vow. Sable didn't raise them to preserve a piece of herself. She raised them because they were the piece she'd lost, and the piece of something greater than species. That following spring, as the snow melted, the 6 pups began to roam. One learned to run, another to sniff the breeze, one stumbled and bit its sibling's tail in a wild game of instinct. Sable watched. She taught by doing. No commands, no barking, just deliberate movement, steady pace, and eyes that never left them. She hadn't birthed them. But they had never known any other mother, because to them, Sable was the mother. And that's why they didn't grow into frenzied predators tearing through the forest. They became a pack with order, with awareness, with memory. The wind stirred the moss growing along a flat rock nearby. Rowan reached out, touched the soft green layer. He couldn't see it, but he could picture it clearly in his mind. A litter not of her kind, yet raised with the same love. No language needed, no bloodline required. Only a heart wide enough to hold something it never gave birth to. Rowan lowered his head, pressing his cheek gently against Sable's still warm neck. You became the mother of children who never called you by name, and today they brought you back to the one who carved that name in wood. A soft breeze moved through the leaves. Not cold, not wild, just a gentle brush, like memory running its hand across a warm shoulder. Night didn't fall over Halberd Forest with sound. It came with a thickening stillness. Above, thin clouds drifted like silver silk across the sky, letting a few cold stars look down on the snow, now smoothed by the imprint of paw prints. In the hollow between 2 slopes, the faint light of night filtered through bare branches, resting on the thick fur of the wolves, curled into a crescent around a center point, where Rowan Hale leaned against the body of Sable. She wasn't asleep, but the tension from before, when danger encircled them, had faded. Her solid frame lay stretched in the direction of the wind, forming a living shield between the blind man and the cold drafts slipping through the rocks. Rowan pulled his coat tighter across his chest. But what he felt most wasn't the cold. It was the warmth radiating from every body around him. At his feet, a wolf lay on its side, its long tail gently covering the top of his boots. Another rested just a few spans from his shoulder, its head leaning lightly against a root, ears upright, listening to the space around them. Every creature, though wild in origin, kept a perfect distance, not close enough to invade, not far enough to abandon. They were present as if they had once learned how to lie beside a human. And that human was her. Rowan said nothing. But within his chest, something stirred, a rhythm that wasn't quite emotion nor shock. It felt more like quiet acceptance, the moment when one stops asking why and begins to understand, because this is how it's meant to be. He turned slightly, resting his hand once again on the thick fur at Sable's neck. You didn't just raise them, he thought. You taught them to live near people, not to obey, but to understand. A wolf shifted, only slightly, just enough for its shoulder to near Rowan's. Beneath the fur, he felt the heat of steady breath, not like a creature on guard, but like one keeping watch. He had stood inside many circles before. The circle of darkness after losing his sight. The circle of loneliness in the cabin through 7 years after Sable disappeared. But this circle was different. It didn't close him in. It kept him close, like something we still dare to call family. Old memories surfaced. He once tried adopting another dog after losing Sable, but that dog barked every night, refusing to sleep at his bedside the way she used to. It feared the wind, flinched at rustling branches, and eventually, Rowan gave up. Back then, he believed he only missed Sable out of habit. But now, with her beside him again, he knew. He missed her the way someone misses the last relative they had left in the world. There were no more questions in his mind. No more, how did you survive? Or, where were you all these years? Only one remained. How did you keep your heart warm through 7 winters without fire? The sky changed hue. A paler streak slipped over the distant ridges. Dawn hadn't come yet, but the light before morning spilled across the wolves' backs like a pale pearl, as if nature itself was acknowledging something never seen before. A human among wild creatures with no distance between them. One wolf rose first, stretching slowly, silently. The second followed, then the third, but none left. They simply moved closer, tightening their formation around Rowan and Sable, not to trap, not to guard, but the way someone would pitch a cloth shelter around a campfire to keep it from wind and rain. And that was the moment Rowan understood. These weren't beasts. They were her children. And now, they were his. Sable shifted, rising to her feet. She turned toward the woods, ears erect, nose testing the air. Rowan recognized that signal. He had seen her do it many times. Each time the wind changed, or a new sound rippled through the trees. But this time, it wasn't because of danger. Sable turned her head, casting a glance at Rowan that couldn't be described with words, then continued toward the forest. A wolf stepped up beside her, then another. No urgency, no formation, just a slow, quiet shift, like water receding gently from the edge of stone. Rowan rose to his feet, the cane still in his hand. But for the first time in 7 years, he didn't use it to feel the way forward. He followed the sound of Sable's footsteps. Behind him, the others moved as well, one after another, in no rush. The circle wasn't closing, it was moving, in a way that only complete things move, no longer afraid of disappearing. The snow beneath his boots turned soft again, a sign the sun had climbed just high enough to bring a hint of warmth, thin, like a blanket passed through too many seasons. Rowan matched his steps to the soft crunch of paws beside him. No one spoke. No growls. No barking. But every creature around him understood. They were walking toward a place no human had ever entered peacefully. Then, from the left slope, a mechanical sound split the air. Different from the wind, different from animal movement. It was jagged and metallic, as if something was tearing through Halberd's stillness, using tools that did not belong to the forest. Sable stopped. A short, precise stop. But it was enough. The entire pack behind her instantly lowered into crouch. Rowan stepped back on reflex, gripping his cane. His eyes couldn't see, but his ears never failed to recognize that sound. The engine of a snow vehicle, accelerating, then the brakes, harsh, grinding, the tracks ripping into packed snow, and a second later, a sharp, heavy click, a weapon being cocked. 3 figures burst from the pale edge of the woods. The first wore a camouflage jacket and carried a scoped hunting rifle. The second had an electronic tracker pole. The third stood slightly behind, eyes scanning the pack, fast and sharp, like blades skimming paper. Before Rowan could react, a voice sliced through the air, dry and colder than the mountain wind. "Don't move, old man." The rifle wasn't pointed at Sable. It was aimed directly at Rowan. Sable growled, a low, heavy growl like stone crashing into riverbed. Not loud, but immediately the wolves fanned out into a semicircle around Rowan. They didn't advance, didn't retreat. They stood as if they'd practiced this 1,000 times, each position deliberate, down to the breath and glance. The second man cursed, backing off a step. "They're surrounding us, Carl. Let's fall back." But the first man, the one with the gun, didn't move. He stepped forward, lips curled into a crooked smirk. "That's him, the man and the dog from the satellite image. Didn't expect him to be blind? Easier to deal with." Rowan didn't flinch. Beneath him, the snow still held the soft impressions of the wolves' formation, but his footing felt sure. Sable leaned into his leg gently, as if offering herself as his cane. "You're hunters?" Rowan asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clearly through the tense air. No immediate answer. The third man snorted. "We're tracking a signal. Your dog's chipped. We came to retrieve it, and maybe see what you know about this pack." Sable growled again, this time not in defense, but as a final warning. Then everything paused for half a second, just before it exploded. The first man, Carl, raised his rifle. The second reached for a blade. The third lifted his tracking pole like a weapon. But just as the rifle crossed Rowan's chest, a thunderous bark shattered the air beside Carl's ear. Sable had leapt, not to bite, not to attack, but to stand. Right in front of the gun's barrel, her eyes locked onto his, her mouth closed, her whole body drawn tight like a bowstring, but she didn't lunge, didn't growl, she just stared. The second man's hands trembled. The third cursed and backed away entirely. Only Carl remained. Carl hissed through clenched teeth. "I don't care about the dog, I just need Dash." He never finished. A sharp rush of air sliced across the clearing. A massive gray wolf launched from the line, crashing into Carl's arm. The rifle flew, skittered across the ice. Carl hit the snow, face first. The tracker pole dropped. The knife spun from his hand. It was over in 3 seconds. Rowan hadn't moved, but his body trembled, not from fear, but because for the first time in years, he knew what it felt like to be protected by the very thing he once saved. Sable turned back. Her eyes weren't red. No blood stained her muzzle, only a strange, resolute calm, like a mother who had just pulled her children back from a lightning strike. Her children gathered around Rowan. No one gave chase. No one retaliated. They held no hatred. They only wanted to preserve what already existed. The 3 intruders vanished into Halberd's woods, leaving behind deep tracks torn through the snow. The scent of gunpowder faded. The stench of fear retreated with them. In that moment, Rowan slowly lowered himself, his hand reaching for Sable's neck. "We don't need guns," he whispered. "Just a circle wide enough so no one gets left behind." Sable pressed her head against his chest. Her children formed a ring around them, not as a wall, but as an embrace of trust. And just then, the first light of the sun pierced through the clouds, falling on the ground where the three intruders had vanished. No more threat, only breath and connection. Rowan collapsed into the snow, his hand trembling as he touched the frozen ground, as if needing proof that he still existed. His cane had slipped away, his coat hung open, his chest rose and fell in heaving gasps, not from weather, but from the storm brought in by men. In the snow, the tracks from the snow vehicle remained, 3 long gashes cutting across Halberd like lashes torn into the earth. But in front of Rowan, there was no blood, no bodies, no sorrow, only Sable, standing with her back to him. Her paws were frozen in place, her posture as firm as stone beneath the drifting snow. Her ears stood tall. Her fur, bathed in early winter light, now glowed with a warm ochre hue. She didn't charge. She didn't howl. She simply stood, on the border between what could have killed and what had chosen not to. The largest wolf stepped beside her, lowered his head to where the rifle had fallen. He didn't bite. He nudged it aside with his snout, then turned to Sable, as if awaiting an order. Sable gave none. Not a sound was made. But behind her, one by one, the wolves began to step back, not panicked, not rushed, but withdrawing quietly, like warriors who had never come to kill. Rowan pushed himself upright. His old body no longer moved like it used to, but he held on to every breath as if it anchored him. One wolf passed beside him, broad frame, golden eyes, but it didn't stare at him like prey. Instead, it lowered its head ever so slightly, as if to acknowledge that he was not a target, but a part of the circle they had just protected. In Rowan's mind, thoughts clashed like wind beating against an old cabin roof. But one sentence rose above the rest, as if whispered into his ear. They did not strike to destroy. They struck to remind mankind that there are limits meant to be respected. Sable turned. Her eyes swept across Rowan, then paused. No words, no reaching hand. But in that look, he knew. He had been welcomed back. The wolves lined up on either side, parting to form a path into the forest. The kind of place no map had ever marked, no human had ever crossed through its first winter. Rowan gave a small nod. His hand searched for the cane. But before he could rise fully, one wolf stepped beside him, shoulder level with his waist, offering its body as support. Rowan placed his hand on its back. It didn't flinch, it didn't growl. It simply walked forward, guiding him. Sable led. The children followed. Rowan walked within them, not as someone being led, but as someone being brought home. As they passed through thinning trees, the snow faded beneath their feet, replaced by the color of old stone. Rowan listened to the soft pads pressing into moss. Here the wind shifted. Growls faded. The light turned gentler, as if the forest itself bowed to what had just taken place. A pack of wolves who chose to protect rather than hunt. A dog who chose to guide rather than avenge. And a life that chose to remain. Rowan lifted his face, not to see, but to feel. He felt it clearly. The sun was rising above the forest edge. Beams of gold fell like quiet threads, stitching themselves into Sable's fur, making her shimmer as if outlined by light itself. And in that moment he understood. When wolves no longer growl for blood, they growl for the justice the forest once lost. Rowan paused. His hand left the wolf's back. He tapped his cane gently against the earth. "Thank you," he said softly, not knowing whether it was meant for the pack, for her, or for the fragile hope that right still existed in a world without reason. One wolf let out a quiet growl, not threatening, but more like a yawn from a creature that had completed its purpose. Sable came closer. She lowered her head and placed her forehead gently against his chest. a touch from a distant past, like the evenings when Rowan played music in the cabin, and she lay quietly at his feet. Everyone was alive. No one had bled. No revenge had been taken. Only a retreat, making space for a return. The forest remained, vast, still, and seemingly endless. But for Rowan, what had changed wasn't the forest. It was the rhythm of his own heart. He was walking with a pack of wolves, not being chased, not wounded, but guided, surrounded like an elder in a family that needed no words. Sable led the way, her steps steady, as if she had memorized every backward-growing root, every moss-covered stone, every leaf thinned by the wind. Behind her, 6 wolves moved in a loose crescent around Rowan. They didn't rush him. They didn't let him fall behind. And each time he stumbled, a warm shoulder appeared beside him to steady his balance. As if they remembered, clearly, the man who had once saved their mother, and now it was their turn to walk beside him, not from obligation, but from something deeper. Reverence. A short growl echoed. Sable stopped. She lifted her head. Before her lay a stretch of sunken ground where twisted roots tangled like ropes clinging to the earth. At the center was a natural hollow, just large enough for a man to duck and pass through. Rowan heard the wind whispering through narrow gaps. The scent of damp wood and fur lingered in the air. Not foul, but familiar. Warm, like the old wool sweater he'd worn during his first winter in Halberd. Sable said nothing. She stepped forward and used her muzzle to brush aside the trailing moss like a curtain. One of the wolves behind her lowered its head and entered first. Then Sable followed. Rowan crouched, running his hand along the smooth, cool earth. The tunnel walls were damp but not cold, some parts jagged, shaped, it seemed, by claw over many years. He felt the curve of the ceiling close to his shoulders, yet the space wasn't stifling. On the contrary, something in the air made it easier to breathe, as if this very place had once cradled the first fragile spark of life that survived the winter's grasp. Emerging from the passage, he heard footsteps. Just one. A wolf, not Sable, not the largest of the pack. A younger one, lean and poised with the steady light of early adulthood in its eyes. It stepped out from a dense thicket, carrying something gently in its mouth. Rowan stood still. Sable did not react, only sat calmly to his right, eyes tranquil. The young wolf approached. It moved slowly, very slowly, each step silent. Its gaze was not fixed on Rowan, but angled downward, as if observing a quiet ritual. Then it reached him. It stopped, and placed a snow-white hair gently onto the ground. No tearing, no blood, no growling. Rowan froze. He could smell the fresh fur, the faint metallic trace of blood not yet clotted. But in the dim light falling through the canopy, the animal didn't look like prey. It looked like an offering. A gift, not for food, not to be divided, but an acknowledgement. A thank you, a reply to a past act. Rowan knelt. He set his cane aside. His aged hands trembled from emotion. You're one of hers, he whispered, born in that den of stone, fed by Sable's milk, guarded by her paws, and now you return, not with instinct, but with gratitude. Sable didn't bark, but she stepped beside her child and pressed her nose gently against its head, as if to affirm that what it had done was right. Was enough. Rowan bowed his head slowly. I gave her shelter once, but you've returned it with something greater, a home in the heart of a forest where no one is ever lost. He didn't pick up the hair, didn't reach for it. He simply remained there, honoring its presence the way old men hold memories, with their gaze, not their hands. The young wolf stepped back. The others didn't stir. They all held their positions, as if waiting for a blessing from the earth itself. Rowan looked upward. The canopy rustled. Snow fell gently from the branches, melting mid-air into thin, drifting threads like confetti from a silent ceremony without spectators. Midday light fell through, illuminating the center of the clearing. There lay the white hare, resting not as a symbol of the hunt, but of a life preserved through love. Rowan placed a hand on his knee, gripped it gently. She nursed you with what little was left in her, and now you return the only thing the wild can offer in its own language. Food may be survival, but it's gratitude that carries life into the next season. The wind passed through, not cold. The scent of earth, fur, and forest mingled into something uniquely whole, the scent of wordless affection. Sable lay beside him. Another wolf settled on his other side. One by one the pack sat again in a gentle crescent around them, recreating the circle from the night before. But this time not to protect, to remember. Rowan closed his eyes. He could not see, but he knew. In the heart of Halberd Forest, he had just been given a gift, one no other man had ever received. The light behind the clearing slowly faded, and the air began to shift, less cold, less vast, and rich with the scent of earth. Sable paused before a tangled cluster of roots, not large but knotted tightly together like the intertwined fingers of an ancient tree. At the center, a narrow slit, one that no one would ever notice unless they already knew it was there. She gently pushed aside a patch of low grass with her muzzle, then turned to look at Rowan. No bark, no growl, only a look, as if inviting him in. Rowan understood. He gave a small nod, steadied himself on his cane, lowered his head, and followed the rhythm of his own breath into a place no human had ever been led into, except those who carried in their bodies the memory of a first winter. The smell of the soil was strangely alive. Not foul, not oppressive, but somehow breathing. The soft layers of earth brushed his sleeves as he walked close to the walls. At one point, he had to crawl, knees grazing gravel, cane dragging behind him. But he didn't complain. There was no weariness that made him want to stop, because with every warm breath that echoed back toward him from up ahead, it was clear. This wasn't an abandoned den. This had once been a home. Moisture kissed his skin. The deeper he went, the narrower the space became, but there was no fear. On the contrary, it felt as though the forest itself was wrapping its arms around him. A wolf followed behind, step by step. Each time Rowan tilted or stumbled slightly, the wolf came closer, steadying him like a living wall. Sable continued ahead, turning her head every few meters, like a daughter gently guiding her father back to the place where her life had once begun. At a bend, Rowan heard something. Not a growl, not an animal's call, but the sound of wind weaving through natural vents, forming a tune like forest flutes. Music never written by man, yet remembered forever by beasts. Rowan smiled. "It's still breathing," he whispered. "This place is still alive." The tunnel opened after the curve. A chamber, not large, but just enough for 8 bodies to rest in a circle. The scent of wolf fur, of decayed wood, of winters long gone, blended into the breath of a home that once was. He knelt. His hand touched the ground. Some parts bulged slightly, shaped like old sleeping hollows. Faint claw marks etched the earth, not deep, but enough to tell. This was once where tiny lives had been raised. Sable stepped forward. She didn't sit, didn't lie down. She simply stood beside him, brushing her body softly against his shoulder, as if to say without words, "This is where I became a mother." Rowan took a deep breath. "I once thought you were gone, but that loss, turned out to be the beginning of something far greater. A family. He didn't need to see. Through touch, breath, and vivid memory, he could feel the traces of life that had once flourished here. Not the kind driven by instinct alone, but a life chosen. Chosen to stay, to nurture, to protect. A breeze slipped in through a distant crack in the rock. A soft beam of light cut across the chamber floor. One of the wolves stepped into the light, lay down with its body bathed in gold, tail curled to one side, eyes calm, as if remembering the very spot it had been born. Rowan placed a hand to his forehead, not from pain, but from emotion. All these years, he thought the cabin was the final shelter. But now, he realized, the place that truly preserved life was here, a den, a tunnel, an unseen embrace. Sable turned her head once more. She didn't bark, but by moving slowly, pausing at a single point, right at the heart of the den and lying down, she told him, "This is where it all began, and where every winter instinctively returns." A wolf approached, holding a worn bone in its mouth. It placed it down near where Rowan sat, not as an invitation to eat, but as a sign. This had once been the first kitchen. No one in the pack made a sound, no howls, no movement. Each wolf lay down in its old spot, not in a circle of defense, but a circle of memory. Rowan understood. Today, he wasn't just guided. He had been accepted as a witness to a home once built with warm milk, sharp teeth, and the instinct to love. He sat in the center of that circle. No need for light, only sound, the steady breaths, the soft scraping of claws on dirt, and wind flowing inward like a lullaby. "This place is an old den," he whispered, "but to an old man like me, it's the only thing that makes me feel chosen to go on living." Sable closed her eyes. Rowan closed his, too. In the heart of the earth, there were no ticking clocks, no screens. Only one thing remained, something every creature knows to carry into the next season. Bond. The sun had not yet fully risen, but the sky had already turned a pale silver, the kind of light that only appears at dawn in a place with no roads, no engines, no tire tracks, only memory. Rowan didn't sense the change with his eyes, but through the thin breeze brushing his cheek, and the way the wolves' breathing echoed more clearly in the thinning air. Sable walked ahead. She didn't run, didn't veer off. She moved as if following a path already known, and each time she paused to glance back, that simple turn of her head carried a silent message. We're returning to where a different part of life first began. About an hour after leaving the old tunnel, they reached a gently sloping ridge, where the snow had begun to retreat, revealing frozen ground beneath. Once, people had built small structures here to measure wind, record rainfall, and count the hours of sunlight passing over the Hulberd Range. No one had lived here in years. Rowan paused in front of a rusted metal sign, its paint almost completely peeled. The words, "Silver Tree Weather Station," remained only as faded white scars on the steel. He couldn't see that, but he could hear it, through the wind whistling across the broken vents, producing a droning hum that sounded eerily like the old tape recorder he'd once used in his cabin. Sable stepped up the crumbling wooden stairs. The rotten planks creaked under her weight. She didn't bark. She simply lifted a front paw and tapped the door 3 times. Inside the cabin, a young technician in a gray work jacket was preparing coffee. The sound startled him. He opened the door, and standing before him were an elderly man, hair snowy white, his coat dusted with frost, a German Shepherd poised with the stillness of a sentinel. 6 wolves, each with a different posture, a different gaze, but all silent, unmoving, Not a single growl or twitch. Oh my God! The man stepped back, mouth open, but no words made it past his lips. Rowan lifted his head. He couldn't see the man, but he could feel the trembling awe in the young man's chest. "My name is Rowan Hale," he said, voice low and steady. "I was lost and brought home." The technician swallowed hard. "Brought home by—" Rowan smiled. "By her family." Sable turned her head, her eyes calm, needing no explanation, no defense. One of the wolves stepped forward half a pace. The man flinched. Rowan slowly raised his hand, no rush, no hesitation, and placed it gently on the wolf's head. "No one here is a predator. No one here is an enemy. You only need to believe, like I did, when I had nothing left but the breath of these creatures." That moment was so silent, they could hear melting ice dripping from the cabin's eaves. The technician stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in. I'll call for rescue, and I think they'll want to see this for themselves." Less than an hour later, the sound of the first helicopter shattered the blank whiteness of the sky. They came. Rangers, journalists, rescue workers, locals with cameras, phones, and recording gear. And every one of them stood frozen when they saw the blind, aged man seated in the center of the weather station yard, beside a German Shepherd, surrounded by 6 wolves, resting around him like guardians of a myth stepped out of legend. A reporter pushed a microphone toward him. Rowan spoke only one sentence. "I didn't find my way back alone, but some paths are only revealed to those who know how to live in gratitude." In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Wolves lead blind man home from the death forest. German Shepherd raises wolves and teaches them to love humans. It's not species, it's heart. The first photo taken at the scene, Rowan with his hand resting gently on Sable's head, a wolf seated beside him like a loyal watchman, was shared over 2 million times within 48 hours. Debates followed. Some feared for public safety, demanding the wolves be captured for being too close to humans. But thousands of letters poured into the Conservation Authority, each echoing a single message. If we can't recognize a family just because it doesn't look like what we're used to, then the fault isn't in nature. And through all of it, Rowan stayed silent. He didn't attend the press conferences. He refused interviews. He simply asked to remain, at the old weather station where he could write, and listen to the wind. Because the story of survival, that part was over. But the journey of bearing witness to love was only beginning. When the first helicopter lifted off from Silvertree Weather Station, carrying the earliest footage, it wasn't just transporting a man who had returned from the brink. It was carrying a wave, one that would ripple through the history of wildlife conservation. In under 2 days, a 1-minute, 18-second video of Rowan sitting among the wolves and the German Shepherd flooded social media. No soundtrack, no narration, just the image. An old man, silver-haired and sightless, placing a trembling hand on the head of a wolf seated close at his feet. Sable stood beside him, not looking into the camera but gazing towards the forest. The press gave her many names: the dog who saved a man, the guardian of the forest. But the name that spread fastest, that touched the most hearts, was White Mother. Not because of her fur, but because of the way she stood in the wind, surrounded by offspring not of her own kind, who bowed their heads before her like a queen born of snow and kindness. Debates ignited. Some conservationists published warnings. The wolf pack has become too accustomed to humans. They must be captured and returned to a controlled zone. A high-ranking official appeared on national television and said, "I understand people are moved." But wild animals are not pets. They cannot tell good from evil. In response, behavioral researchers countered, if the world is touched because these animals behave better than humans, then maybe the lesson is ours to learn. An elderly scientist, once awarded for his work in evolutionary biology, wrote in a journal, "If a dog can raise 6 wolves and teach them not to kill humans, it doesn't mean instincts have changed. It means we need to expand our definition of the instinct to love." Outside academia, the online world had long picked a side. The hashtag #whitemother flooded Twitter. Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, platforms once filled only with dance clips and remix beats, now echoed with images of Sable standing in the snow, a symbol of something that felt both mythical and real. A 10-year-old girl in Colorado, after reading the news, mailed a handwritten letter to the National Conservation Agency. The letter said only this: "I don't understand why grown-ups want to split the wolf family. My mom says, family is when people get through winter together. If that's true, what's wrong with this one?" That letter, photographed by a mailroom worker and posted on Facebook, reached 1 million shares in 36 hours. Its final line became a rallying cry. "Don't break a family just because it doesn't look like the one in your textbook." Rowan said nothing. He still lived in the cabin near the weather station. He never left the forest's edge. He refused interviews. He declined all offers to publish a memoir. He just wrote, on a Braille typewriter, page after page, recording every breath that kept him alive. A week after the video went viral, someone captured a silent moment. Sable and the wolves standing on a snowy ridge, looking out over the plains, where crowds gathered with cameras, raising their lenses, but none daring to move closer. The wolves didn't snarl, didn't growl. They simply stood, silent and regal. A university professor told his students that week, "Sometimes the lesson we need most isn't in a biology chart. It's in learning to lift our heads and be silent in front of something greater than knowledge, unconditional connection." Then, one afternoon, during an emergency meeting between the National Forest Service and wildlife protection groups, a decision was made. No capture, no separation, no relocation. A territory was outlined, expanded beyond the old forest boundary, and it was named White Forest Sanctuary. Here, the wolves and Sable would live on their own terms. No cages, no tracking chips, no training. Just open snow and freedom. The news aired nationally under the headline, "For the first time in history, a wolf pack is officially recognized as a family led by a dog." That evening, Rowan added one more line, not typed in Braille, but spoken aloud into a recorder. "Sometimes, the things born from suffering are the only things that make the world pause long enough to look at one another with compassion." The story of Sable and the wolf pack no longer belonged to the Halberd Forest. It was no longer just the memory of a blind man who survived the snow, nor just a strange clip that went viral online. It had become a symbol, an unnamed gathering point for hearts longing for a kind of love that defied all logic and classification. Countless articles were published each day, each one carrying a different headline. "The Mother Dog and Her Children of the Wild." "Family doesn't need genes, only presence." "She raised them with her own loss." Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, a single mother from Oregon posted a photo online. A piece of wide-ruled notebook paper with shaky pencil letters in a child's hand that read, "My mom doesn't look like me, but she's still my mom, so that dog is a mom too. Please don't take her babies away." In the bottom corner, Elena, 7 years old. At first, the letter was only shared in a small group for adoptive and foster parents, but within hours, a well-known author reposted it with the caption, "This is the most perfect summary of all the arguments we've tried to reason through these past 10 days." And then, it exploded. News outlets picked it up. Evening broadcasts featured Elena's handwritten line as the rallying cry of an emotional movement. An animal rights group renamed its campaign, "Because Love is Not About Look-alike." Thousands more letters began to pour in. Adults, children, teachers, survivors who had once been rescued by dogs. They shared their own stories of being saved not by their own kind, but by a kind of trust no words could explain. One person wrote, "The day I lost my parents, my neighbor's dog sat beside me all night. It didn't say anything, but I didn't need anyone to." A fifth grader emailed the Forest Service. "If people are scared of wolves because some of them attacked once, how many good people have been misunderstood just because they got angry one time? This pack didn't do anything wrong. So why break them apart?" At the Federal Wildlife Protection Bureau, a legal advisor sat quietly before a stack of files. On his desk was a pile of handwritten letters, some smudged with ink, some wrinkled, a few with crayon marks or cartoon stickers. He didn't read them all, but each one he pulled at random shared one thing in common. No one spoke of fear. They only spoke of what they felt. The most viral quote from Elena's letter, "My mom doesn't look like me, but she's still my mom," was printed on t-shirts, notebook covers, posters in school hallways. A renowned documentary filmmaker proposed a full-length series titled Families Without Species. An animation studio began sketching Sable and her 6 wolf pups, with drooping ears and eyes full of knowing. Rowan remained silent. He didn't use the internet. He had no social media. But one university student brought a recorder to his cabin, letting him hear a broadcast of Elena's letter being read on national radio. Rowan sat for a long time, saying nothing. Finally, he whispered, "I've lost the ability to see the world, but thanks to a child, I now know the world is not blind." That afternoon, Sable rested her head on Rowan's lap while the wolves spread out quietly around the cabin yard, just as they always did. A soft breeze came from the forest, carrying the scent of pine resin and melting snow. No one spoke. But everyone knew. It's often the smallest things that tip the scale of the biggest decisions. 2 days later, the Department of Conservation made an official announcement. "We formally recognize White Forest Sanctuary as a legal protected reserve. No one has the authority to separate any beings living there, not for science, not for policy. Because here, we are not protecting animals. We are protecting a way of life." From that day on, whenever someone asked how a dog could be called the mother of 6 wolves, there was no need for research papers or viral videos. They only needed to read one sentence, spoken by a 7-year-old child. "Because my mom doesn't look like me, but she still loves me." The sun rose a little earlier that morning. Not blazing, not harsh, just enough to soften the face of the snow, casting tree shadows across the halberd woods, like someone had gently draped a white wool scarf over nature's shoulders. Fragile, but warm. Rowan sat outside his cabin, fingers wrapped gently around the wooden handle of his familiar cane. Beside him, Sable lay in perfect stillness, her breaths steady and calm, like the same quiet rhythm that once led him across a frozen line between life and death. Above, an eagle circled wide in the sky, and just below it, where the trees thinned out into a field blanketed in snow, a large wooden plaque had been erected overnight by the very people who once debated for days on end. The inscription on the wooden plaque was dark and hand-carved, plain, yet unmistakably clear. White Halberd Sanctuary, a place without fences. No one needed to explain further. No one wanted to change a single word. Because with just one sentence, the world understood. This place didn't need to be redefined. It only needed to be recognized. Rowan couldn't see the plaque, but he heard the soft strikes of the wooden mallet as it fastened the hooks into the ground. He sensed the shift in the air. Not the breath-holding tension of days past, but a quiet, steady acceptance from both sides, man and nature. As always, Sable was the first to rise. She stepped silently toward the trail that led into the newly opened sanctuary. There was no gate, no warning signs, no barbed wire, only an open stretch of land, bordered by things that couldn't be replicated, fallen pine scent, the wind brushing through tangled roots, and paw prints of wolves overlapping with those of a dog. Her young followed, not rushing, not restless. They knew this land belonged to them, not because they claimed it, but because someone else chose not to take it away. From a distance, a documentary filmmaker wept at the sight. Not because it was grand, but because nothing about it needed to be grand to reach the human heart. All it took was a blind man laying his hand on the head of a dog who had raised wild creatures out of a grief no one else could hold. All it took was a forest with no fences. Along the trail, small wooden plaques had been placed. No footnotes, just simple carvings in raised letters where a mother doesn't need to be of the same species. Here, loyalty asks for no terms. If we can bow to a creature that knows love, then perhaps we've learned something that matters. Rowan read each plaque with his fingers. With every one, he nodded, not because he understood, but because he remembered. When he and Sable crossed the boundary into White Halberd, he didn't stop like the visitors who came just to take pictures and leave. He kept walking, with two wolves beside him, unleashed, unbound, without GPS. They simply moved forward, knowing that as long as they walked together, they wouldn't be lost. Near the end of the day, as the light mellowed, Sable lay down in a patch of soft ground, where moss and dry leaves made a quiet bed. Her 6 pups, now grown, settled around her, forming a natural arc. Rowan leaned against the trunk of an old oak, his hand resting gently on her back. No one spoke. Nothing more was needed. Only the breeze whispered across the forest. And this time, it wasn't cold. It was kind. And for the first time in many years, he smiled. Not because someone had saved his life, but because he had witnessed something still alive in this world. A family that didn't need biology to exist. A home with no roof. A boundary with no gate. A love with no definition. The halberd wind still blew in the same direction. But in the small cabin with the brown roof nestled at the forest's edge, the wind no longer carried the bite of snow or the echo of loneliness. Rowan Hale sat where he always had. The wooden chair creaked slightly beneath him, one armrest worn down from use, and in front of him sat an old Braille typewriter, still bearing a faint scratch from the time he struck it in frustration during those first years of blindness. But today, his fingers no longer trembled as they touched the keys. Outside the window, Sable lay curled on the porch, her head resting on the wooden step. The 6 wolves, no longer as close as before, still roamed somewhere in the woods, occasionally leaving new prints near the wildflower fence. No one fenced them in. No one held him back, and no one forced him to write. But Rowan wrote anyway, because memory, once it survives, should never be left to decay in silence. He tapped out the first line, each letter rising beneath his calloused fingers. This is the story of a blind man guided by what he could not see. Pause. Deep breath. Then more keystrokes. The words stretched across the page like a road he now knew by heart. Not because he remembered every turn, but because he had learned to listen to things he'd never heard clearly before. He didn't try to write fast. He didn't need to. He let each sentence flow from his fingers as if he were retracing his steps inward. He wrote about the morning he thought would be his last, about the feeling of slipping on invisible ice, about how the wind swallowed sound, and how a single bark broke through layers of time, pulling him back from the edge, not of death, but of despair. On the next page, he wrote about Sable, not calling her dog, not pet, just Sable, like the name of an old friend who returns in a dream, bringing things no one believes in, but that feel more real than anything he's ever touched. He told of 6 living beings, not born of the same kind, but who lay pressed together through a snowstorm night, forming a circle that required no doctrine and no vow. He didn't try to describe them by size or shape. He simply wrote, "They breathed together, slept together, and silently taught me that survival doesn't come from being stronger, but from trusting the right place." In another part, his fingers moved longer without pausing. "Someone once asked me why I never left this place, now that everything is calm. But they don't understand. For me, calm doesn't come from crowds. It lives in the moment when you reach out your hand and something presses its forehead into your palm, not out of duty, but out of love." Outside, a gentle breeze drifted through the trees. Late autumn leaves fell quietly, brushing against the moss-covered earth. Sable stretched and walked closer to his feet, then lay down again, without needing a command, without needing her name called. Rowan said nothing, then kept writing. On the final page of his first manuscript, he typed a line that felt like both an ending and a beginning. "I once lost everything, my sight, my family, my reason to move forward. But one day, in the forest, I was guided, not by light, but by the memory of kindness, and from then on, I no longer needed sight to see." He placed his hand on the page and brushed over the braille. Each dot rose beneath his fingers like a small, flickering lantern in a foggy night. Not bright, but just enough to keep the heart from going cold. Evening fell. A soft howl echoed from deep within the forest. Not fierce, not loud, just tender, like a mother calling her children home beneath the young moon. Rowan nodded gently. He said nothing, just laid a hand on Sable's head and murmured, "We're not finished. There are still things left to tell." The small book, with its white cover and gently raised letters on coarse paper, was released quietly on a winter morning. No advertisements, no launch campaigns, only one simple line on the back. For those who were once lost and found their way by what couldn't be seen. Its title was, "Those Who Walked with Mother." No one expected it to be noticed. And yet, it spread like the first breeze of spring, drifting through a forest still damp with mist. Children in classrooms read it aloud before recess. Elementary teachers began using it to teach empathy. A high school in Vermont pinned an excerpt from the chapter "The Circle of Trust" to their bulletin board under the heading, "Family Doesn't Require the Same Species." At a medical school, a student wrote a thesis comparing the emotional nervous systems of humans and wolves, but ended it not with a textbook citation, but with a passage about the first embrace between Rowan and Sable. The story moved beyond the printed page. It became the topic of ethics seminars. A group of conservationists in Sweden translated the book into their native language and quietly mailed a hand-bound copy back to Halberd in thanks. A United Nations speech on expanding the definition of shared communities quoted a line from Chapter 16. "It's not that we don't have fences, it's that we don't need them." While the world stirred over what he had written, Rowan Hale remained completely silent. No emails answered, no interviews granted. He never left the cabin. He simply rose every morning, reached out to touch Sable's neck, older now but with a gaze that held something time could not age, then sat at his desk and reread the Braille version of the book, one line at a time, as if reading his life from the beginning. When a national news team made the trip to Halberd, he opened the door, listened to their greetings, and quietly said, "I have nothing more to add, Everything's already in the story. I'm just waiting for something." A 10-year-old boy from Pennsylvania sent a handwritten letter to the cabin, written in blue ink with shaky lines but pure sincerity. "I don't have a birth mom, but I have a mom who adopted me. After reading your book, I understand that being a mother isn't about giving birth. It's about standing in the wind for someone when they're scared." Rowan kept the letter in a small wooden drawer near his chest. He never replied. He simply nodded whenever he remembered the final line. "If I ever meet someone left behind, I'll walk with them, just like Mother Sable did." A publisher offered to make a film. A fashion brand wanted to print the 6 wolves on a t-shirt with the slogan, "Pack of Empathy." He declined them all. Rowan replied with just one sentence, "Don't turn the sacred into something to sell." And yet, among all the refusals, there was one thing he couldn't turn away. A pencil drawing from a kindergarten class in Maine. It showed a small cabin, a man without eyes, and a circle of 1 mother dog and 6 wolves, all lying beneath a heart-shaped sky. Beneath the drawing, a scrawled line read, "Teacher said, 'Love means not being afraid of different.'" Rowan placed the drawing on his bedside shelf. Beside it, Sable's old collar, once torn during the storm 7 years ago, now repaired with a piece of twine, like the world trying, in its own quiet way, to mend what once seemed lost. That day, when the first snow of the season softly blanketed Halberd once more, Rowan opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Sable followed, slower than before, but every step still steady. Rowan spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. "Maybe what I've been waiting for wasn't someone arriving, but the day the world learns how to walk together without needing to be shown how." In the snow, 2 trails of footprints stretched side by side, one human, one canine, then disappeared into the thick forest. There was no path, but something was still being written, in a silence the world was finally learning to hear. The snow began falling again by mid-afternoon, light as an early winter breath. No wind, no crack of frozen branches, only tiny flakes, fine as chalk dust drifting down over the wooden deck in front of the cabin. Rowan sat still, one hand resting on the armrest, the other sensing each flake melt slowly across the thick wool blanket spread over his knees. In the thin air of the deep woods, every sound became significant. A trembling branch could be a message. The soft rustle of dry leaves might carry something that had never found words. And then he heard it, a sound just quiet enough to make his heart stir. Footsteps, not rushed, not heavy, but calm, measured, and purposeful, like the melody of an old song his body still remembered. Rowan tilted his head slightly and smiled faintly, his chest warming before his skin could register it. A shape emerged from the edge of the woods. Dark brown fur brushed with ash gray. The frame wasn't as agile as before, but each step landed firm, as if the snow dared not resist. Sable. She didn't run, didn't bark. She simply walked, past the tree line, past the leaning wooden fence, toward the porch, as if she had never been away. Beneath the frost-laced coat, her shoulders trembled slightly. The old scars were now just patches where the fur grew uneven. But her eyes had never changed, calm, deep, and tender, like a piece of earth that had never known harm. Rowan lowered his hand to the porch floor. "Welcome home, girl of the snow." He wasn't sure if he said it aloud or whispered inside, but somehow Sable heard. She stepped onto the porch, paused a beat in front of him, then bowed her head, not from exhaustion but as if by instinct. Rowan reached out, fingers searching the air until they found warm fur, soft, familiar, and so deeply known that his heart ached at the touch. Sable pressed her head gently into his palm, exhaling as if to whisper, "I'm still here." Rowan didn't ask where she had come from. He didn't ask why today, after so many silent months, she had returned. Because when something becomes part of your very being, answers are no longer needed. Sable lay down beside his feet, just like the old days. The snow kept falling, but the world felt quieter. A kind of peace that didn't come from everything being okay, but from knowing. You no longer had to stand alone in this vast world. In the distance, where the white haze of snow gave way to the pale gray edge of the forest, 6 silent figures emerged, heads lifted, tails low. Their steps weren't those of predators, but of those who were coming home. 6 wolves, now fully grown, bodies strong, coats thick and clean, but in their eyes, something still lingered from a long-ago night beneath frozen stone, when they had once been cradled in arms not of their kind. They didn't come close. They stood a few meters away, forming a quiet circle around the cabin porch. No barking, no growling, only presence, warm as glowing embers in the dark. Rowan nodded. "You've all grown." Again, he wasn't sure if the words left his lips, but without doubt, every one of them heard. One wolf, with a long white streak running from neck to chest, took a step forward. It didn't look at Rowan. It looked at Sable. Sable raised her head slightly, didn't move, but her ears lifted. They didn't need to touch. No licking. No nuzzling. Just standing in the same circle was enough. Above them, the last rays of the setting sun broke through the heavy clouds, casting a thin beam of light across the forest, like a thread connecting this moment to a memory that didn't belong to time. Rowan exhaled softly and closed his eyes. He wasn't sleeping. He was listening. Because on evenings like this, you don't need sight to know. Something sacred is happening. The snow lay thick on the ground, but the cold was gone. The air felt warmed by something beyond fire, beyond blankets, beyond the wooden roof overhead. Rowan remained seated in his familiar chair on the porch. The Braille typewriter rested quietly in his lap, but his fingers had long stopped moving. He no longer needed to type, for every word that needed to be said had been replaced by breath, by the sound of snow melting on the roof, and by the soft murmurs of memory. Before him, the 6 wolves didn't leave. They didn't crouch like guards, nor tiptoe like wary scouts. Each stood in place, forming a gentle arc around the porch. No tension, no struggle. They stood like soldiers, silent and reverent, as if this place were a sanctuary. The final light of day filtered through the distant canopy, casting a soft silver glow across their fur. In that moment, no one thought about the distance between species, between instinct and affection, between flesh and memory. Because all that remained was presence. One wolf, with a thick, dark brown coat and a white mark across its chest shaped like a crescent, broke away from the circle and slowly walked toward Rowan. It didn't glance at Sable. It didn't seek permission from the pack. It simply moved forward, as if called by a thread that needed no voice. Rowan heard the crunch of its steps in the snow, light, soft, yet deliberate, before he felt the warmth of its breath brushing against the back of his weathered hand. And then something remarkable happened. No licking, no nudging. The wolf simply lowered its head and, with a gentleness rarely seen in something born of the wild, pressed its nose into the center of Rowan's palm, as if bowing in gratitude. Rowan slowly curled his fingers, holding on to that moment for a few seconds, as if he were cradling the heartbeat of memory itself. No one forced it. No one called its name. But love, once sown, always finds its way back. Sable remained by Rowan's feet, unmoving, silent. She didn't whimper, didn't shift. She simply watched, like a mother witnessing her children return to righteousness, not needing to instruct nor desiring reward. Then, without a sound, she lifted her head and gently rested it on Rowan's lap, right beside where his heart beat. Rowan exhaled, one hand resting on Sable's back, the other still holding the warmth left by the wolf's touch. He couldn't see anything, but he didn't need to. The most important things in life often don't exist where light can reach. His voice emerged, quiet, yet deep and warm like a stream running beneath snow. You're not like them, but you are their mother. Sable didn't move. The wolves stayed still. But a soft breeze passed through, carrying the scent of forest, the trace of snow, and a stillness so deep that even time seemed to pause in reverence. Rowan tilted his head, gently running his fingers down Sable's spine, then spoke again, his voice tinged with a tightness that only hearts can explain. And I was just lucky enough to be loved by all of you. Far away, across a sky turning indigo, a thin cloud stretched like breath in the wind. The tall pines swayed gently, releasing the last flakes of snow onto the quiet ground. No more gunfire, no more engines, nothing left to distort the path of this story. Inside the cabin, the oil lamp had long gone out, but outside, light came from the presence of every living soul gathered there. That night, no one left. Sable slept by Rowan's feet. The 6 young ones lay scattered around the porch, resting their heads on one another's legs, as if they had been waiting for this moment their whole lives. Rowan said nothing more. He simply sat in silence, eyes closed, and listened to his heartbeat blend with the quiet breath of family. No grand speeches, no shining emblems. The story of Rowan and Sable had begun with nothing more than an old leash, a single step through snow, and a heart wide enough to believe in things it could not see. Sable was not a special dog because of her coat or her training. What made her a mother did not come from instinct, but from a choice made in the coldest moment of her life. When she wrapped her fragile body around 6 newborn beings that did not belong to her kind. German Shepherds are known not only for their intelligence and endurance. What truly makes them silent heroes is their unconditional loyalty, their uncanny ability to understand human pain, and the way their eyes always look forward, toward those they love, even when facing the edge of life and death. This story is not just for those who love dogs. It's for anyone who has ever questioned whether love can cross boundaries. Because sometimes, family doesn't begin with blood. It begins with a return in the middle of a white winter, a head resting beside you on the porch, and the belief that love, once planted, will always find its way home.